We're on the last one, are we?
Paragraph 16. We're on paragraph 16 of chapter 5. I put the link in the chat there. So
And so I would like his irony explained to me.
I will explain this irony. Yes, let's drop this first opening sentence into the chat of paragraph 16. So this is for those just joining us. This is Kenneth Smith wrapping up his introduction to the medieval worldview and its epoch, and he's spent the previous 15 paragraphs contrasting the major strokes of the ancient worldview against the major strokes of the medieval worldview, and showing how what we see in this transition is not just it's not a continuation of the same thing, and it's not just something different. In most cases, it's the opposite. The things that were most important to the ancients are now deemed the least important by the medievals, and the things that the ancients thought were vices, the medievals now think are virtues. It's a very intent. It's basically a revolution in the conception of the world. So in paragraph 16, he's sort of he's wrapping up that discussion. For those who want to follow along, the link is in the chat. So here's the first sentence, and Stephen's asked about this question about the irony, and it's worth talking about here. In paragraph 15, we were talking about the difference between the ancients and the medievals about whether religion is public or whether religion is private. The ancients believed that religion is public because it's a public good specifically, that without religion serving the function of helping people to focus on mentally growing up, that they wouldn't do it. It's not easy for us. It doesn't come naturally to us. And so for the ancients, religion and prayer were considered to be as essential as clean water or tillable soil. You just can't have a polis without it, and it has to be functioning correctly. But the medievals turned that inside out, as we saw from the quote from the New Testament, where Jesus is exhorting people to pray in private, not to be hypocrites who pray in public, hoping to collect social goods from being seen to pray, from being seen to be religious. Instead, the medievals, following Jesus's line, they want religion to be private. It's a private relationship between you and God. And and the fundamental function of religion is no longer to keep the polis working. That's a secondary function. The primary function is to save your soul from damnation. You don't want an eternity of torture. You want an eternity of, harmony with God. And so to get that, you have to get things right in this life. And that involves, among other things, a great deal of prayer, which must be done in private to avoid the vice of, various vices of vanity and pride and so forth. So he's just handled that contrast for us in paragraph 15, and now he's turning that discussion more tightly to the question of daimones, of what is the daimon. And as Stephen points out, he launches this sentence saying, the Greek concept of a daimon was an ironic thing, an intensively private force within one's sensibility, which could not be seen or known by one's own conscious self. Because one's daimon so biased one's powers of judgment, no one could himself tell whether he was being steered by a benign or a malignant daimon. So all of this is rushing off. Right? Anytime you're talking about daimones, anytime you're talking about character, we're talking about this is a direct reference to Heraclitus, right? Ethos, anthropoi, daimones. He's you learn the pattern with Kenneth Smith. You learn what his loaded terms are, and when you see those loaded terms, he's making an oblique but very powerful reference to a specific orientation. And with ethos, anthropoi, daimos, he's bringing up as well the issues that are talked about by Cornford in his books From Religion to Philosophy, and his other book, Thucydides Mythhistoricus, where he is examining the plays of Aeschylus and using them to show that the ancient Greek religion was more a religion of daimones than it was a religion of the Olympian gods. That the Olympian religion was added on top of it as a superstrate, and that by the time of the Peloponnesian War, plenty of people were atheist from the perspective that they didn't believe literally anymore in the Olympian deities, but they all still believed in the model of the human psyche that's captured by the old daimon religion, and that's captured in Heraclitus's line ethos anthropoi daimon. So in this first sentence, clearly Kenneth Smith is evoking all of this, and he's talking about the issue that how you see the world, what you even notice about the world, is predetermined before your brain can ever get involved by the structure of your character, your ethos, which is your inner nature. And as Heraclitus has said, the nature inside us is as big and profound and infinite as the nature outside of us. You can spend your whole life exploring your own character and still not fully grasp it any more than you can fully grasp, the laws of nature around you or the details therein. And so it's got to be this ongoing exploration to try to figure out who the hell are you? Now, what is your character like now? What does it hide from you? What does it bring to your attention? Where does it focus you? And that shifting awareness and focus, and that set of priorities that's emerging from your ethos, it pre-formats the kinds of thoughts that your conscious mind can think. You can study all you like and try to be as rational as you want. It's still not going to do you any good as far as seeing the world the way it literally is, because your character is pre-selecting and pre-editing out from you the vast majority of what's in front of you to leave behind the things that it considers important. And then when we engage rationally, we're reasoning from the premises that have effectively been selected for us ahead of time by our ethos. So what he's talking about here is how important it is to figure out what the hell your ethos is, and how difficult it is to figure out your own ethos. You can't look at yourself objectively because you're looking through the very filters that you're trying to detect. It's like the fish in the water. It's very difficult to it's very difficult to detect water when your whole life has occurred in the water and never anywhere else. That's how it is with your ethos. So this is what he's talking about here. This issue with irony, well, I won't be able to finish talking about that until we do sentence 2, but I wanted to get us a little intro here to talk about the paradox that he's talking about here. That on the one hand, the ethos, nothing is more personal than your ethos, because it gets between you and your thinking and the world. It's right in the middle of everything. You can't think, you can't feel, you can't judge, you can't evaluate without your ethos being involved, on the one hand. But on the other hand, you're the last person in the world to know what your ethos is, because you're blind to it. It's predetermining what you notice, and it doesn't want you to notice itself. So you take for granted all kinds of things that you think are objective, but only other people, especially from other epochs, with other worldviews, from other ages, only those people could look at you and go, wow, that is a weird thought you just had. And you'd say, no, it's not. It's perfectly normal. Anybody would think that. And the outsider is the only person qualified to say no, anybody would not think that. Only people like you think that way. You don't recognize your own distortions and biases and assumptions. They're built into you. So on the one hand, it's private, but on the other hand, despite being the most private thing, it's the thing you have the least direct understanding or perception of. And that is a weird state to be in, but it's central to the ancient religion. That's what the ancient religion was founded on. We had 2 sets of hands up. And the first hand, although it's been put down, I'm going to call just to see. Passion, did you want to come off mute and tell us what was on your mind?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I accidentally hit the mute button. Go ahead and take yourself off mute again. Great.
Yeah. I'm trying to phrase this question so it remains on subject, but I don't think I'll ask that. My first question.
Okay.
Maybe we'll ask that later. But I did want to make this comment.
Yeah.
The demos or the daemon in Greek culture and Greek religion. In Christianity, that becomes the demon or the demons or the daimonos.
Sort
And
of.
yeah, and so in Greek culture and religion, in Greco-Roman religion, whereas the daemon was this unseen force that was amorphic, in Christianity, the demon or the daemon takes on a form. It takes on not more than one form, even though it still remains amorphic in the sense that it can change shapes. It does
Yes.
have a shape and a vapor in its of itself. It's a spirit, so it can take other shapes. It can take other nightmarish forms. And it's not necessarily, except for the neutral ones amongst their kind that are benign in that they've taken an oath and vow of neutrality, you get these other demons that are rather not, they're not malignant, other than those are the truth, the ones that are on a neutral factor. But like you get the ones that are evil and malevolent would be the words that priests would use or exorcists would use. Malevolent. So you got the ones that are good. You got the not demons that are good, but you have angels that are good, and the demons that were angels that are now evil.
Yes.
I think that's an extremely interesting evolution from the daemon from Greek culture into now Christianity.
Yes. Yes. You put your finger right on one of the most important parts of the medieval revolution. Thanks for bringing that up. So, what Passion's talking about is this issue that to the ancients, everything has daimones. Thales is it's either his second or his third proposition that I don't have it in front of me right now that says that all of nature, everything in nature, is ensouled. That suke is in everything, and suke is the psyche. But to the Greeks, the psyche is both a mind and a spirit, and as such, it contains each suke contains an ethos, and the ethos determines the specific characteristics of that soul, what makes it what it is and not something else. And why does an acorn grow into an oak and not grow into a maple tree? It's ethos, and that ethos takes it takes the form of laws of nature. On the one hand, the Greeks are happy to equate ethos with physis, with the natura. They say your inner ethos is also your physis, but it also takes the form of a kind of intelligence, and for the Greeks, intelligence is bound up with psyche, with air. When you inhale your psyche when you're born, and you exhale it when you die, and that leads to an equation of psyche with daimon. Anything that has a kind of intelligence to it, whether it's a conscious intelligence like a human being, or whether it's an unconscious intelligence like a fungal mycorrhizal network in a forest, it has a psyche. That's what it means to be intelligent. And because it has a psyche, it also is a daimon, in that it's going to have certain tendencies in how it grows and acts and changes over time. A waterfall has a daimon. A specific tree that's growing on the edge of a cliff, and its roots are holding it up. Some of them are pulling to keep it from falling over, and others are pushing down against the cliffside to keep it from tipping. That's and it grows less on the side that leans over the cliff and more on the side that doesn't, to keep itself balanced, to keep itself from falling off. These kinds of juggling acts, represent a kind of psyche at work, and therefore a daimon at work. So to the Greeks, the whole world was full to overflowing. It was a plenum of daimones, of intelligence, as the Greeks say. Here too there are gods, says Heraclitus, and Thales says nature is full of gods, and he's referring to the daimones. So to them, daimones could be good, they could be bad, but mostly they are natural, and they are what they are, and they're trying to act out, what evolution has gifted them with, what the directions that they're growing and changing in. But the medieval revolution is transforming the concept of a daimon into the concept of a demon. And where the Greeks say you can't have nature without a daimon, nature itself is a daimon. Every person's nature is a daimon. The ancients say, no, daimons are not necessary parts of nature, because first of all, nature has no authority. Only God has authority. Nature has no authority. And there's only one God. So we have to get rid of all these daimones. So what we're going to do is invert the value proposition. Instead of saying these are important, valuable things you should be attending to, we're going to say these are bad, optional things. You not only don't you need them, you shouldn't have them. They're coming between you and the one God. They have to be purged. And it's why Jesus is casting out demons over and over in the stories in the New Testament. Is he's offering a revolution. And in the revolution, you will be freed of all daimones, that is demons, And finally, you will be free of them, and they won't control your behavior anymore. You won't have to sin. You won't have to be separated from God. You won't have to go to hell. You can be saved. You'll become an open, empty vessel for the Holy Spirit. And when the Holy Spirit enters into you, you are filled with grace and you're saved. So this equation it's a transformation. Instead of daimones everywhere being part of the architecture of the cosmos and the human mind, they're now seen as parasites that have to be eliminated and gotten rid of. And the concept is there is only one daimon that you should have, and it's God. And everything else is some kind of falling short of that. It's a huge transformation. And it explains why there's so much discussion of casting out demons in the New Testament. Why that miracle? Why not some, loaves and fishes? Sure, there's a variety of miracles he does, but why over and over do we keep casting out demons? It's because that's the demarcation line that the new religion has come to end the daimonic world, which is now interpreted as a demonic world. And instead, we're gonna have only one spirit, and it's going to be a Holy Spirit. So thanks for putting your finger on that, Passion. I mean, that's really important. This is really central to the medieval revolution. Phil, tell us what's on your mind.
Well, what's on my mind is that, when I was in the meetup about Plato's laws, I said, seems like human beings need indoctrination one way or the other, right? And that seemed to make sense with the diamonds. You can't do it, so society have to provide a way of indoctrinating you so you could grow into understanding that relationship. But so does Christianity. I mean, Christianity, there's a mysterious force that's beyond you, but in some ways you're indoctrinated in a mysterious way. In a sense, it constrains you. And now I'm thinking about Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard wanted to remain pure to the religion, but at the end, there seems to be a conflict between the self trying to understand God and God himself. So there's that conflict right there. So there's a gap that's created, even though supposedly if you just internalize yourself, you could, approach God, but there seemed to be a problem. And I was reminded, when I was in college, actually my best friend, he was taking care of his nieces because his sister had become a drug addict and then can't take care of them. And one day he was telling these kids, they're like 6, 8, and 10. Okay. He was telling them something that definitely was controversial. I didn't want to interrupt him because he was parenting. But I pulled him aside and said, "What the hell are you doing?" He said something very sensible, but it doesn't make sense. He said, the world is full of indoctrination. I want them to be able to think for themselves. So I want to put this and that, and then they have to choose it. I told him, "Are you kidding? These are kids. You're going to get them so confused. They don't know which way's up." At what point do you allow them to choose between the various indoctrinations and say, "Oh, that's that," I mean? So therefore, bringing up, at what point do you introduce these various indoctrination? At what point is it helpful? And what point does it become so confusing and destructive? Then I thought of Jane Eyre, Sense and Sensibility. Seems like that's the internal relationship with the diamonds itself. But I was also thinking of John Austen, who obviously took Jane Austen to another level, and took that name, and he talked about sense and sensibilia. In other words, there's intelligence within the world itself. So there was a relation between the external and the internal that, in a sense, to me, was reaffirming the internal relationship, but also coordinating it with the external relationship as well. So that seemed to me like I don't know what, I mean, he's sort of like an analytical philosopher, but he's way to the left of analytical philosophy. And he seemed to be one that wanted to make the bridge between the two. And I kind of think in some sense, in a moderate sense, science is trying to find the sensibilia in the world. And in some sense, although they don't have, they don't have, I guess, a structure because it's all kind of hypothesis that they work on, which I won't get to the next point, which in a sense is trying to, in some sense, negate the Copernican turn, in some sense. In other words, the Copernican turn is a good thing, but it become so fulfilling that we are the ones that give meaning to the world. that's just not true. There's a coordinated relationship between that. So I thought I'd bring that up because the internal and the external relationship is something that we have to somehow always manage, because there is sensibilia in the world and there's a sensibility in the internal diamonds. So I thought I would add that to what we're talking about.
Thank you, Phil. Appreciate it. Good stuff. Passion, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Just to carry on and carry off what Phil was saying. And Phil, by the way, great comments, great comments. Every society, we all have indoctrinations, and every society does that. I mean, it's everywhere. There are good indoctrinations going on, and there are bad indoctrinations going on. And then, when a parent says, oh, don't believe that, you have to learn how to think for yourself. A child's going to go, I just want to read Dr. Seuss and get Christmas presents and birthday presents. What are you talking about? Think for myself. I mean, a child is too young to learn how to think for themselves all the way through. Because then if they were thinking for themselves all the way through, they'd be like, I gotta die, I gotta grow up, gotta pay bills, taxes, gonna die, gotta buy food because I gotta eat. I mean, children don't have to think for themselves. They just gotta play around with their toys and watch TV and play video games and not learn about mortality until it's the very end. But yeah, everyone does have to think of themselves at the right age. For me, that didn't work out so well because I didn't have the right tools because I'm visually impaired and I couldn't, and I don't see so well. So I didn't understand good concepts or educational type concepts when I was growing up. But took me a long time until I became a certain level of edumacated, and even now it's rough. Um, but and to learn how to really, I think it's not that we need to I mean, it seems when I go back and I read stuff from the Enlightenment, and will we be touching the Enlightenment, Will?
We will eventually. It's about a year and a half to 2 years off.
Okay. When I read stuff from the Enlightenment period, I look at stuff now, I sit and I think and I wonder, I'm like, well, in the Enlightenment period, their paintings were better, their art was better, their poetry was better. Even though we know a lot more scientifically now, they wrote better back then. And up until the turn of the century, they were still writing better. And ever since we went this technological era, we just got super dumb. It's like when you read the books that people are writing now, except for a handful, I mean, I don't know. And you read the Enlightenment, it's like we just dumbed ourselves down.
Yeah, the early stages of an epoch, like modernity, the Renaissance is the early stage of modernity. Those are difficult stages. I mean, to be a thinker during those times, you're having to confront the worldview that everybody around you has and that you have, but that isn't working anymore because you're trying to break away from the late corrupt kind of stage of the previous epoch. It's not working, but you don't know where to go from here. And so you're trying, based on your criticisms of the old epoch, you're trying to develop a new worldview. This is what the medievals are doing in the 300s, 400s, and 500s, within the ancient system. As ancient Rome is getting more corrupt, they're dissatisfied with it, and they're looking for answers somewhere other than in the old worldview. This is similar to what the Renaissance folks are doing, pushing back against the corruption of the church and the corruption of the nobility, which we'll talk about as well. To what extent does the chivalry and noblesse oblige turn into brands by the end of the medieval period instead of actual living value systems? And how frustrated are people pushing back against people who claim to be chivalrous and claim to have noblesse oblige, but are actually just lining their pockets and screwing over the peasants? So, that stage of development forces people to be smart. It forces people because the one thing that they know they can't do is take for granted what they're being told because they don't believe in it anymore, but they don't know where to go. So it forces this creative intelligence. Where we're at in the late stages of an epoch, it's the opposite. We're not yet at the complete destruction and everything falling apart, although it may seem that way some days to us, depending on what news article we've read lately. But it hasn't all fallen apart. We haven't all lost our homes. Many of us still have electricity and clean water. You can sort of sense where we are in the process. But we're at the point where we're really frustrated and fed up with a lot of what's going on around us. So there's in this stage of an epoch, there's a lot more momentum to the existing system. It hasn't completely lost its power yet. And as a result, there is a strong flow that it's easy to just go with, that works or sort of works, or at least sometimes works. And that discourages creative intelligence. That's about rote learning and following the patterns, right? To obey the law, move along, don't ask questions. These are the sorts of things that people were telling medievals. That's what the powers that be were telling medievals in the 1300s and 1400s, and what the Roman Empire was telling ancients in the 300s and 400s. Just go with it. Just don't question it. Just we'll rote teach you this stuff. Just learn it, and your life will mostly work. And it's not until it stops mostly working that people start pushing back and going, hey. And this is the origin of Hegel's famous criticism of philosophy. The owl of Minerva only takes flight with the fall of night, because it's only when things aren't working anymore that you're compelled out of your comfort zone and forced to start thinking about these things. So I think the contrast that you're making between the level of intelligence in the early stages of the modern epoch versus the late stages is right on the money. That's with something similar would be seen contrasting medievals in the 400s, 500s with medievals in the 1400s and 1500s, and likewise, presumably the same thing would have happened, with ancients from the early stages compared to the late stages. Certainly, you see it all over the place. You see it in every aspect of culture. So you can be looking at Latin studies, just the language itself, none of the complexities, no political economy, no philosophy, just language studies. And they'll tell you that the golden age of Latin died with Cicero. Maybe it lasted a decade or two longer, but it didn't last much longer than that. By the time the emperors, were a going concern, they left the golden age and were entering the silver age, where they still had all the outward refined rhymes and rhythms and grammar and lovely metaphors and similes, but increasingly they were trying not to talk about things that might get them killed. Cicero, his death had this chilling effect where people are like, maybe I shouldn't talk about how Mark Antony's a dick and he's a fake, and because then Mark Antony might send someone to stab me in the neck. Maybe I'll just talk about beautiful poetry and love stories and origin stories and things like that. There's a decay that happens, and the Silver Age is still considered part of the classical age of Latin, but it's the decaying side of the classical age, and it's followed by late Latin, in which even the grammar starts to fall apart by comparison. So we can see this decay process happening within the stage, within any given epoch. And Hegel gives us the tools to assess why would it be that the acorn and the young sapling have all this incredible vitality and creativity, whereas the old diseased oak it's not dead yet, but it's got considerably less energy to give, right? It's hanging on by its roots, doing the best it can, but it's not growing new trees anywhere. It's doing its best to pass that responsibility on to somebody else. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I did a talk last week. I actually quoted the first paragraph of this page. My talk was the medieval God, the cosmic dictator, because to be in the medieval church was to live under the Stasi. You were being watched, your opinions were being noted. And I was looking at the history of the common perspective of the history of religion. So if you go back into a very ancient past, they claim, well, you had anism and you had totemism and you had nature worship. For example, the Finnish Kalevala seems to have heroes rather than gods. Man and nature sort of still have a very intimate interrelationship. Then you come to the period of the sort of the classical pagan gods, which is a step up conceptually. This is a culture which is involved in hierarchy and the acquisition of wealth. This is a culture which we easily remember from classic sources. Then we come to the axial age and the rise of what we would deem as reason. And that age starts to think, well, why have all these deities when you can just have the one God, covering everything, covering every aspect of life? Now, the interesting thing which came with the axial age was skepticism. People began to become skeptical about the values. For example, well, whether the gods exist. So, well, for example, you could be having a very successful life. You could tick all the boxes, and then what's the name of that one? Ecclesiastes. The Christian work, the Christian poetry. What?
Ecclesiastes.
Ecclesiastes. That's it. Which claims, well, you can have all this stuff, but it's simply vanity. Here we have a very strong picture of skepticism. And it intrigues me. What's the difference between the pre-axial age and the axial age? And the pre-axial age seem to have a culture which we're no longer familiar with. For example, I'm starting to wonder if you became skeptical, they viewed that as a sickness. Oh, you're skeptical. That's an illness. You need to go to the temple and be cured. Buddhism, you have Siddhartha. He's the whole thing, which he's completely in the grip of this sort of skepticism about existence. This might have worried a few people. I suppose the Christians thought, the old method of curing skepticism has fallen. Jesus has come along to be the new system of curing skepticism. So there were these various stages of development. But now we're discussing the pagan pantheons era and the transition to the monotheist, the absolute spirit. But of course, Nietzsche famously points out that we've gotten rid of the old religion. But did we get rid of the absolutism? Because the modern humanist is the inheritor. Hegel was the inheritor of an absolutist view of the world, an absolutist view of the universe without the absolutist God anymore. Man has made himself the God and started to think that his own ideas about everything are absolutes. As Max Stirner pointed out to the humanists, that you've appropriated my own property. My humanity is my property. How dare you appropriate that and raise it as a God above me? It's the idea, the modern way of doing things seems to be the idea of the perfect human. Well, the Christians conceived of a perfect humanity, but there was only one being which could rise to that. The rest of the Christians excused themselves and said, we have something to look up to. We have the perfect human as presented to us by Jesus, but we will never reach that level. But there is something to inspire us that it's worthwhile to be a human, because this God became a human. We've gotten rid of the God, and now we have humanism, which is saying, there's perfect humanity and you can get there. You can become a celebrity. You can pray in the marketplace and your perfect humanity. And all the rest of you must look upon us. We're the great ones. We are the humans which are like gods. Okay, thank you very much for listening to my long-winded bit there.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, nice overview of several thousand years there when it comes to these takes and the relationships between them. So let's go back to your earlier question and look again at the irony of private versus public just a little bit. I'm going to do just a touch more on this sentence, then we'll move on to sentence 2 because it follows nicely. So one of the ironies is, on the one hand, your inner nature is very private. It's your nature and not anybody else's. It's closer to you than it is to anyone else, because it's your awareness and thinking and behavior that it's affecting. When Heraclitus says ethos anthropodaimon, what he's saying is that your ethos has so much authority over you as an individual that you might as well treat it like a god. Just like Poseidon is the controller of the ocean, or the embodiment of the laws of nature of the ocean. In the same way, your ethos is your controller and the embodiments of who you are as a person. That's where your individuality lies, where your distinctive personality and character lie. So he's saying that this is that it has this kind of authority. Now he's saying something else, and we're going to come back to this repeatedly over the next year and a half as we work our way through the medievals. He's saying something else, which is, to Heraclitus, your ethos is not fixed, right? Because a daimon, a suke, an ethos is an organism. To the Greeks, all things are organisms. Even a pebble is an organism. And all combinations of things that are in relationship to each other are kind of super organisms made up of other organisms. And this kind of nested organisms within organisms, linked together through relationships, is the fundamental structure of the cosmos to an ancient Greek. Not the modern idea that the universe is a place and it's got some things in it, and you can go get those things and become rich or get your practical needs met. That thingly idea is very Newtonian. Objects in motion, unchanging, eternal objects moving from place to place and bonking off of each other. The Greeks have this more organismic, natural idea that things are growing, they're transforming, they're changing from what they are into something else according to the inner laws of growth within their ethos. They're driven to seek out certain things, and because of that, they're going to enter into certain relationships with other things because of that inner ethos. And the combination of, Stephen and I interacting with each other, we generate a kind of joint organism that is the result of our two ethoi interacting with each other and kind of resulting in this larger ethoi, which again to the Greeks acts like another organism, a third organism. And you look at the number of people on here and you do the combinatoric math, and you can see we're talking about a bunch of organisms in this discussion from the Greek perspective. So all of that is intrinsic in the concept of a daimon. It's not an object It's not a Christian or modern concept. It's the ancient concept of a life unfolding according to its own inner laws of development and forming larger relationships and larger organisms. So on the one hand, it's private because nothing is more personal than those inner laws of growth and those preferences and awarenesses. But on the other hand, it's not private at all, because everything that you do when you act in the world is the results or the signature of your daimon, your character in action. Even if you can't see the consequences of your actions, other people feel those consequences. You know, even if you say you're in the government and you have a terrible policy that you're enacting and you think it's going to be a great policy and only good things will result. But meanwhile, millions of people are suffering as a result of your policy. But you can't see it because you don't talk to those people ever. They're not part of your worldview. The consequences escape you. So you have an idea about what your character is, that you think is what drove you to do this thing. But everybody who's suffering, the millions of people who are suffering from you, they have a much clearer idea about your character because those consequences that are hidden from you are all too apparent to them. They feel the impact. Now, that's not direct knowledge. They can't directly inspect your character, but it's indirect knowledge, and it's very strong indirect knowledge. It's public. The consequences of character are public, even though the character itself is private. And of course, what's in this sentence, the part of the paradox that's in this sentence is, as we said before, but now expressed a little differently, even though it's private in the sense that it's inside of you, it's not private in the sense that just because it's inside of you, that doesn't give you any deeper insight into it than other people have. There are some things you can see about yourself that other people can't. Granted, that would seem to say, yeah, it's a private thing. But there are other things about your character that you can't see that other people can see more easily than you can. And that means it's also public. So this kind of paradox, you know, you're in Heraclitean territory, right? Heraclitus loves a paradox. His whole line is that this is the architecture of nature. It's all built on paradoxes. It's these palintropies where opposing forces are pulling on each other in order to create a healthy norm in between that has enough strength in it, enough vitality in it that it can react to shocks and push itself back to normal. This is the normal structure that the Greeks expect. So when he's talking about it being ironic, he's also saying it's paradoxical. He's saying there's palintropy involved. And as we saw in chapter 4, Heraclitus is our premier philosopher of palintropy. He talks about it all the time in various metaphors. So that's the setup for getting into sentence 2. I'll call on Phil, though, first. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, my thought is, I wonder, I know you love Heraclitus, so do I. But I wonder how different he is from Parmenides. Because it seems to me that they were dialectically, in some sense, opposites. But on the other hand, I see them as mutual in this sense. If Heraclitus was wading in the water, crossing the river, he's seeing the details, what's happening now and all that kind of stuff. Seems to me Parmenides is like standing on the top of the hill, looking at the guy wading across the river. So he just got a different perspective. And I wonder whether we need to somehow manage some unification or at least some interchange between Parmenides and Heraclitus to really get the full picture of the Greeks, because it seems to me, on the one hand, you do want to get a kind of more total, I guess, formal diagram you want to put in Platonic language. But on the other hand, you want to see the intricacies of the detail of what's happening, kind of like Aristotle. So it almost seems to me like Parmenides was Plato and Aristotle was Heraclitus in some sense, but transformed. So I wonder whether you could just remain as Heraclitus and swimming in the river and seeing all the changes and reacting to it and say you're part of the organic relationship. And part of it is that, no, you have a different view standing on the hilltop and seeing how there actually is a river flowing. I mean, I wonder whether when we're focusing on one, we're sort of negating the other on the other way around, and whether the fact of them, they somehow are the two parts of the sandwich that in a sense is squeezing the meat in between. I just wonder. I mean, it just seems to me maybe we ought to study Parmenides at the same time when we study the Greeks as well as Heraclitus. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Well, I'd say a couple of things about that. And the first is I cite Heraclitus a lot, but when talking about the philosophy Panta Rei, all things flow, Plato doesn't just attribute it to Heraclitus, he also attributes it to Homer.
Mhm.
And so the usual Heraclitus versus Parmenides, contradiction that we like to look at, it doesn't apply when you're talking about Homer, because Homer, all the Greeks admit, Homer is the teacher of the Greeks. Homer is what every Greek is raised on. It's why the festivals exist, the Olympics, the Nemean, the Isthmian, the Olympian Games. The reason that they're happening, we attract people with the sports, but then we make them sit through the relay race retelling of the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? That's what it's for, is to get people there because they're trying to imprint the Olympian religion year after year on all these people. And it's why you're not allowed to fight a war during this time. You have to put down your weapons and go to the games. And sure, you can play around with the competitions, but then you have to listen. You have to listen to the Iliad. You have to listen to the Odyssey. So they're all raised in it. And Homer is the one who's saying that the word for nature is phusis, flowing, transformation. So when I think about Heraclitus and his discussions of phusis, I increasingly disagree with the later people who said that Parmenides and Heraclitus represent two poles. And I think that with Heraclitus, what we're actually seeing is a partial systematization of Homer, an attempt to turn religion into philosophy, to say, well, if all things flow and yet we still see the river is there, how do we explain that? And so with Heraclitus, you get the supposedly Parmenidean position of acknowledging that there is a river, right? He says, into the same river we step and do not step, we are and are not. So he's encompassing both positions. He's saying there is a river and there isn't a river. There is us and there isn't us. It's changing and persisting at the same time. And so I think the core of Heraclitus is to be found not in the concept of radical change and no continuity, but in the concept of continuity via change, which is why Heraclitus says it is by changing that things are at repose. They exist because of the changes happening inside them that allow them to continue to exist. And that really captures this organismic concept that the Greeks had, that everything is not an object, everything is an organism that's growing and flowing and changing and working to be what it is and to become what it's going to become in the future. Parmenides, by contrast, he has no truck with dialectics, no truck with paradoxes, no truck with contradictions, and he really doesn't like flow and change. And so he's the one that's saying, there is no dialectic, there are no organisms, there is no transformation. All there is being. And because there's only being, there's only an eternal, unchanging sphere. And all the things you see are illusions. You don't exist, the tree doesn't exist, the acorn doesn't exist, there's nothing, there's nothing to see here. This is, I don't think, Kenneth's take on this is that this does not represent some alternative majority or even significant minority opinion in Greek culture. This represents someone who's discovered logic and taken it to its farthest ends. Kenneth Smith calls Parmenides the discoverer of the tautology. Being is a tautology. It can't be false by its very nature of its statement. It's a self-contained circle that, and in as such, it's a perfect ideology. Once you get into it, there's no way out. All possible further, other than going into the ideology deeper, any kind of inquiry that might threaten the ideology is ruled out. And that's why he had Zeno and his followers out there trying to trip people up with logical contradictions to keep them from asking the most obvious questions about Parmenides' philosophy. He tried to make them look like fools. His whole thing is very radically anti-Greek. It's the new logos culture arising in some ways in its purest form. Logic without any empiricism, denying the existence of the whole world and everything in it, and instead postulating his imaginary logical construct. It's pretty radical. But what we can say about it is Homer would have no truck with that. There's no place in Homer for any of that. And Homer is what everybody's raised on among the ancient Greeks. So, yeah, I'm happy to quote other things than Heraclitus for sure. But I don't think turning to Parmenides is the solution for finding balance. I can't think of a modern metaphor, but it's sort of like going to the flat earthers for balance on whether the earth is round. It's like, yeah, there are some people who question whether the earth is round, but they don't represent any significant trend in modernity. They're despite all the attention we give them. It's just showing how rigorous the thinking is becoming in that age, that they're taking logic all the way to the limits, like Parmenides is doing. If you accept his proposition, these are the conclusions you have to reach. So
I have to disagree slightly, because if being is, the problem is being is not a thing but a gerund. So is is. Is a verb and a gerund. So therefore it's in between. I mean, it's not being is not a thing. It's a thing that's becoming. And is on the way of becoming. I mean, is not like, that's it. I mean, that is it. No, that's not it. So I think the fact that he tripped you up on being is putting it in shaky grounds as far as I'm concerned. Because they're both sort of halfway between a verb and a noun. And so it's a very curious relationship being is. So that's part of my disagreement, but I'll leave it at that.
the Greeks were obsessed with their own language. They loved Greek. This is why they call anybody who doesn't speak Greek a barbarian. They're saying if you don't speak the Greek language, you can't even think. When you try to talk, it's just bar 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 bar. It's just noises. They say you're like a cow. You're just emitting. The problem with that kind of, this is by the way, in exactly the way that the Greeks were not religiously genocidal, they were linguistically genocidal. They thought their language was the right language, and all other languages were wrong. Now the problem with that is that every language has strengths and weaknesses, and Greek has some incredible strengths, and I'm looking forward to learning them, probably starting 2 or 3 years from now, as I'm currently working on Latin. But it's going to have weaknesses too. They've all got weaknesses, right? And what Parmenides is doing is saying, because the Greek language has the verb to be, ipso facto, that proves that kind of existence is real. Things can be in a perpetual way because the Greek language has the verb to be. That proves it. And all the rest of it is just rationalizing that the language is perfect, and these are the conclusions you get to. By contrast, in Spanish, you've got 2 different verbs to be. And one of them is for more permanent things, and one of them is for more temporary things. Like, where am I right now? I use the verb estar, because in a little bit, I'm going to be somewhere else. And it wouldn't make any sense to use an eternal verb of being to describe my location. But when I say, that I am Rick, I might use ser, the permanent verb, because no matter where I go, I'm still going to be Rick. So Spanish at least recognizes that existence needs to be, the language needs to be able to talk about not just permanent, eternal, unchanging existence, but also changing temporary existence. And that's a strength that Spanish has over Greek. I'm sure it would have alarmed Parmenides a great deal to encounter the verb estar, had he ever done so, assuming he took it seriously and didn't just accuse the Spanish of saying bar, 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 bar. So anyway, let's move on to sentence 2. So this is running again with this idea of the irony of the idea that a daimon is private, and in this where he's, Kenneth is building on this question of, are religion and prayer private things or public things? It's a public to the ancients and private to the moderns. But he's exploring some of the details of that by showing parts of religion that are private even to the ancients. He says only other people studying dispassionately the oblique evidence of one's general course of actions and drift of life could make that determination, whether you're being steered by a benign or a malignant daimon. And as many tragedians and philosophers remarked, only after one's life was safely over is it possible to say decisively whether it was governed by a good or wholesome daimon, eudaimonia, commonly mistranslated in Aristotle's Ethics and Politics as simplistic happiness. By modern, when moderns translate eudaimonia, we call it happiness, and that's completely missing the point. The question is, do you have an ethos that is close to sophrosune, so that your daimon is usually nudging you in the right direction for health and vitality for you, your family, your neighborhood, your species, and all life on Earth? That would be sophrosune. The more sophrosune, the more the direction, the teleology of your ethos / daimon aligns with sophrosune, the more the Greeks would say you have eudaimonia. You have a good or healthy or beautiful daimon. Conversely, if your ethos or daimon tends to point you away from what sophrosune would point us towards, if it points us towards illness or health for ourselves at the cost of destroying our environment or family, or vice versa, creating health for our family and environment while destroying ourselves. Any of these things the Greeks would recognize as not what sophrosune would point us to. Sophrosune is the harmonizing of our path with the larger path to create a healthier whole and a healthier self. So if it's not doing both of those things, or if it's not doing any of those things, it isn't sophrosune, and they would say you've got a bad daimon. It doesn't harmonize. It's not beautiful. It's not healthy. It's not good for you. No matter how strong it might be, no matter how willful you might be, it's leading you astray. And so they'd say dysdaimonia. Kenneth used to say he would get taken to task by philosophers who would say that there's only Greek evidence for the word eudaimonia. There's no evidence in the literature for dysdaimonia, and therefore the Greeks didn't have the word. And Kenneth would say, well, first of all, that makes no sense at all, regardless of whether we have, surviving fragments that use the word dysdaimonia. It makes no sense that the Greeks wouldn't care about this term, because it's the center of their entire religion and philosophy and worldview to distinguish between eudaimonia and dysdaimonia. But also, he says, there's trace evidence, you see in Shakespeare, where Othello, the play Othello, Shakespeare names one of the characters Desdemona, which is clearly derived from the Greek dysdaimonia. And he says, you don't have to prove that it's there to see by studying the structure of the religion and culture that it would have to have been there as a concept. I mean, they contrast you and dys in all kinds of other contexts. There's no reason they wouldn't make that same contrast with daimonia. Since they've got the one, they'll have the other. So he's not naming it here, but this is a little bit of background controversy that he brings to this picture. So you can see what he's talking about here is that this issue that on the one hand, your daimon, your ethos is so personal to you, but on the other hand, vast parts of it you can't ever detect directly. And in fact, you, more than anybody else, you have conflicts of interest. You would have a tendency to want your ethos to be better than it is. I mean, who wants to think of themselves as a bad, sucky, sick person, right? We want to think of ourselves as good, as healthy, if we can, if it's available as an option. And so if we're going to mislead ourselves, it will usually be in the direction of overestimating the virtue of our own ethos. And it's the other people who are encountering the consequences of our actions and who can't ignore it because it's affecting them, who are the ones that could tell us, Oedipus, about your character. I wanted to say it might not be as good as you think it is. There might be some issues here, some things that you need to address. So likewise, Agamemnon or any of the other characters of the tragedies. And it's why tragedies exist. He cites tragedians explicitly, but it's why tragedies exist, is for someone with the skill, the oratory skill and the creative powers to tell a story that puts a human being or a character representing a human being into a position where the truth about their character is exposed whether they like it or not. And what makes it a tragedy is that they may have plenty of virtues, but they still lacked that critical insight into who they really were and what the actual consequences of their actions were. And so they're dependent upon the other characters in the play, the chorus, and the audience to witness the actual consequences, and thus from that determine the actual character of the persona who's moving around on the stage. This is all, it's why tragedy for them was not just entertainment. It was a religious, it played a religious function, right? And it's a religious function designed to expose this deeply private thing in a public way, because if you can do that, then it creates the opportunity for other people to learn from the mistakes of the character being depicted so that they don't have to make those same mistakes. This is like, you know, in a hospital, when people do mortality reviews after a bad event, a bad outcome in healthcare. You want to talk it out and make sure everybody learns from it so you don't have to keep repeating that mistake over and over. This is what the Greeks are trying to do with human ethos. And the fact that tragedy is claimed to be the invention of Dionysus, the new god, the new Zeus. And that Dionysus, as we discussed before, is paired with Apollo on the temple, physically on the temple at Delphi, at the oracle, that one side has Apollo and the other side has Dionysus. It shows the extent to which the Greeks really believed that this issue of what is your personal character and how can we get it exposed and how can people learn from it, it is paradoxically both intensely private and intensely public. Everyone has a stake in what your character is, but it's your character and not their character. But maybe their character can learn from your character. It's like, these are, you know, we're talking, when you talk at this level, you can see the dialectics involved, the palintropy. There's all of these bending back of opposites into these tight dynamic systems that are full of energy. And, you know, part of what's in here as well, which is critically important before we go on to the sentences that follow, is this idea that your ethos is not fixed. I started to say this earlier, and I got distracted by something else. But your ethos is not fixed, right? The Newtonian concept of an ethos would be it's an object inside you or a program inside you, and it's fixed. But the Greek concept is organismic, not thingly. And because it's organismic, the ethos grows and changes. It has its own laws of development inside itself. It's an acorn wanting to grow into an oak. And so the Greeks believe that you have the right and the responsibility. Remember this sentence from, I think it was either paragraph 14 or 15. You have the right and the duty and the responsibility to try to learn about your own ethos and then cultivate it into healthier directions. Try to weed out the vices, try to encourage the virtues, build up better habits, so that as you change your ethos, your daimon, so you change your fate. Character is fate isn't meant fatalistically. It's meant that you have a duty to cultivate your fate by cultivating your ethos. And this is why this is not a fatalistic thing. There is a realm, there's room here for freedom and for self-actualization, to use the, you know, recent Rogerian concepts. You're not stuck. Your fate is not determined by the stars. That whatever happened in the past only got you to where you are. Where you go next is up to the extent to which you can cultivate a better character for yourself. And it's easier to, this is where it comes full circle, it's easier to cultivate a better character for yourself if you can see an object lesson of somebody else with your characteristics coming to a bad end, not by chance, but because of who they are, because of those features of their character. And then maybe it improves the chances you can look in your own character and go, oh my God, that's me. I see myself up there. I don't want to end up that way. Okay, I've got some work cut out for me. What do I need to do in order to not end up like Oedipus? Nobody wants to marry their mom, give birth to their own siblings, kill their father. Nobody wants that outcome. What do we have to do to not be Oedipus? This is a powerful motivator for the Greeks. And what it's motivating them to do is to stop passively accepting themselves as a fait accompli and start treating themselves as a work in progress that it's their job to finish. You with me on all that? You see sort of how this all holds together? You can see why, with this kind of a concept of the self and the other and how does religion play into this and all on, you could have a going concern for 1,000 years or 1,200 years or however long the ancient epoch lasted. I mean, there's a lot of sophistication. There's a lot of descriptive power here. It's mostly lost by the time you get to the Roman Empire, especially the late Roman Empire. But it was present earlier. And that was when it was energetic and lively. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
What's the problem with Oedipus? He seems to be rash at the start. Actually, he seems to lack skepticism. He seems so convinced that what's in his head is the perfect mirror of the truth, even though he's being warned. There was a guy that warned him that people he thought were his parents might not be his parents. He doesn't seem to meditate on the question here. He meets his dad. Okay, we're having a fight over turf. Well, I kill the other guy. That's the way to go. Okay, come to a town. They're looking for a hero to marry the queen. Well, obviously, you're going to marry the queen. There's a lack of skepticism. There's a lack of inquiry. And Oedipus generalizes. He's a person who's learnt the ability to generalize, and somehow that enables him to solve the problem of the Sphinx. And he wins that battle. But there's a downside of generalization where you fail to pick up on the particulars. The Sphinx is a creature which seems to be the combination of a number of contradictory features. And he must generalize it into a whole. But that's the risk. You lose it. Sometimes the particulars can be very important. Sometimes you can gloss over the particulars, and we have to. Our modern society wouldn't work unless we generalise. But there can be a price. Goethe's the one that warned about this. He warned about our tendency to generalise would result in this disastrous aspect where there would be particulars which are important that we've missed. But this is a curious thing that it's as though Oedipus refuses to be skeptical. He doesn't know how to handle it. If he finds some skepticism within himself, he doesn't seem to be comfortable with it. He immediately makes another rash decision, ultimately only to learn the really hard way about being too rash. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, it was brought up by you or Phil, I can't remember, a few months ago, that the riddle of the Sphinx, he gives the general answer, but he misses the particular answer. The answer is you, Oedipus. You walk on 4 legs in the morning and 2 legs at noon and 3 legs at night. And we're talking about your life and the continuity between what happened to you as a child and what's going to happen to you, in the future based on the choices you make today. Like if somebody doesn't give way to you at a ford on a river, that's no reason to kill them. It doesn't matter if other people are routinely getting angry and killing people for not stepping aside. You've got too much ego. You're right. You're driving this thing with your will, and you're not willing to leave room for the truth. You're so sure of the truth that you are a danger to your parents and you must get away. Then you're so focused on that that you've filled yourself up, like the Zen parable says. If your teacup is full, you can't learn anything else. You gotta leave some emptiness for the truth to move in. And Oedipus doesn't do that. He's sure of himself right up until it all comes crashing down. At least in Oedipus Tyrannus. I know, as Phil routinely champions, the later Oedipus is a different creature than the early Oedipus.
It's that final bit, what the creature that walks on 3 legs as the stick. Of course, that's where Oedipus ends up. He's blinded himself. So he needs this external object to replace what he had lost in his eyes. He needs a stick to measure out what's around him in his darkness.
Yes.
So yes, the prophecy there was Oedipus himself.
Yes. And part of the hidden irony in that riddle is other people will have to wait until they get old to walk on 3 legs. But Oedipus won't. He'll be at his prime when he's converted to having to walk on 3 legs. He's going to tear his own eyes out. He's going to be the one who forces himself from 2 legs to 3 legs by the the violence he inflicts against himself when he realizes what he's made of his life. So this is that thing, right? It's Oedipus is there for other people to watch in Oedipus Tyrannus and to learn from, and hopefully pay some attention. And this is what the Greeks are making of the Iliad and the Odyssey and the other tragedies. Is they're saying all these stories of these great heroes who are supposedly better than we are, they ruined the world. Yes, they had these virtues, but let's also talk about their vices. Let's talk about what happens when you're not just proud, but too proud. When you're not just courageous, but too courageous. What happens when you have an excess of a good quality? It turns back into a vice again. And a huge civilization composed of these powerful egos, all armed with these astonishing gifts, they destroyed Bronze Age civilization. This is something we need to learn from. This is why Homer is the Bible, is the teaching book, the primer for all Greeks. They're trying and trying and trying to drive home the lesson by seeing what happened to other people so that we ourselves don't have to repeat those mistakes. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm glad you talked about Oedipus because I have a question about Antigone. Now, and Sophocles wrote Antigone when he was pretty young, and he won the prize for the tragedy. When I read Antigone, I always saw her as a hero. I find it very difficult for me to find that dysthymia within her. I wonder whether I'm reading the play incorrectly, at least in relationship to how the Greeks saw it. Because if you saw it the way you said, it is a tragedy. It's not a comedy or whatever it is, it's a tragedy. Then she's not the tragic hero, although she suffered tragedy. Cleon is the tragic hero. He's the one that made the mistake and destroyed the civilization by wanting to build a new civilization. So have I misidentified who the hero was because I worship Antigone so much? But in fact, the play was won because of Cleon. That's the real tragic hero. Is that true? Give me your analysis of that.
I love that you champion Antigone in these discussions. I mean, I'd have to say both of them are. This is a tragedy with 2 tragic characters. And because remember that Sophrosune isn't just about doing what's good for the cosmos, like by obeying divine law, like the law of burial of relatives. Mm-hmm. It's also about harmonizing with the human world. And what she's doing is taking a position that aligns with divine will, but goes directly into conflict with nomos, with the law, as Cleon is setting it down. And so she wins on the one hand because the God's will ultimately come true, but she loses on the other hand because she does it in a way that gets herself ground underfoot. She's she's a victim because of the way that she embodies the divine will. And this is it's a reminder. The Greeks we find the Greeks very pessimistic by comparison with our blithe optimism, but the Greeks noted repeatedly that the favorites of the gods tended to come to bad ends. It's often the case that when you're on the right side, you're gonna get crushed. And it doesn't mean that you should disregard the gods. It just means that you don't do it out of a desire to be happy. You do it out of a desire to do the healthy thing, the right thing. And sometimes that means you're going to get executed, which is not a happy thing and not a good end. So I say Cleon's got his issues and Antigone's got her issues. And Cleon wields the power of the polis, and that's enough to crush Antigone. But she wielded the power of the gods by being in alignment with decay, with divine justice, and that's why in the end, Cleon has to relent even after she dies.
Well,
yeah.
Then there almost seem to be a real great question about the gods, because they did the wrong thing. I mean, instead of saving her while she's still alive, I mean, like, they started the whole thing. She actually didn't start the whole thing. I mean,
Yeah.
how come they didn't identify whatever God was that was on her side as the real tragic hero? I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I find and it's funny that then they're now blaming the gods. Well, I guess the Greek had some skepticism about the gods, so yeah, maybe that's correct. Yeah.
Well, and their approach to the gods is so different from the medieval approach or our approach, right? They don't see the gods as Santa Claus or as a tyrant, either one. So you're not there begging, please don't hurt me, and you're not there begging, please get me a pony. Neither of those things works particularly well with the Greek gods, with the ancient gods. It's more like you pray to the gods to remind yourself that these parts of the world, these parts of the cosmos, are powerful and have authority, and you need to be aware of them and think about how you're going to harmonize with them. And the ones that you ignore, you can't harmonize with because you're not paying attention. But just because you see them doesn't mean that there's necessarily a good outcome. It's like, if you're caught in a landslide, the laws of nature are going to work on you, whether you are paying attention to the landslide or not paying attention to the landslide. The healthier thing to do in the short run was to find some way not to get into the landslide. But once the wheels are grinding together and you're caught between them, the outcome's going to hurt. I'm going to keep going back to Antigone. I mean, I feel like there's more there, but certainly Sophocles' powers as a tragedian grow over the course of his career. Passion, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I'm wondering, when did it become okay to say that perhaps in death we will not get to look over our lives because we will not be living them anymore, and we will just be fertilizer pushing up daisies, little daisies around our graves, for we were all born astride a grave, and that's where we will die, astride a grave.
I got the final part, but ask the first part again. When you said, when did it become okay?
When did it become popularized and okay for people to be out atheists?
Oh, to out atheists. Can you rephrase that?
When did it become okay for people to become out atheists? In that the
Oh,
they
you mean
spread their
openly? You mean openly atheist?
Yes.
So the Greeks are unusual in this regard. But not unusual enough. During the heyday of the Greek era, you were required to believe in the Olympian pantheon. This is part of where Socrates gets in trouble, which is going to be discussed in sentences 3 and 4 in this very paragraph. But they didn't say you couldn't believe in other gods. And what believing meant to the Greeks was largely following the forms of the rituals that made up the life of the polis. You had to participate in the festivals that were your family's festivals, your tribe's festivals. And as long as you did that, what you actually personally believed didn't matter that much. It was when your outward behavior began to not harmonize that questions began to be raised. Things became a problem. And this is because, as he talked about in paragraph 15, as Kenneth talked about in paragraph 15, religion is a public function. It's a function of the polis. It's gluing the polis together. So what you think privately, as long as it doesn't affect your ability to go through the rituals, then they didn't care that much. Which is why, as as Cornford points out, by the time of Thucydides, Thucydides himself describes the entire history of the Peloponnesian War without a single reference to gods involved in the causality of that war. There's not an incident in there where he says this only happened because of Zeus or Ares made these guys lose. I mean, which is a huge contrast from Homer. Homer's deeply religious. All of his descriptions involve the gods, meddling all over the place. But by the time you get to the Peloponnesian War, written by Thucydides, there's no reference at all to the supernatural being the main driver of what's happening. It's what Cornford's talking about in Thucydides' Myth Historicus. He's saying what you have, according to Cornford, is practicing religious people, but privately atheist people, right? That they still do the ritual, so they don't get in trouble, but they don't personally explain the world using the Olympian deities. So that's a kind of atheism. It's a form of atheism. You see a lot of that later on in from Renaissance on. You start to see more and more of that kind of coming back. That kind of atheism. Now there are atheists after the period of the Peloponnesian War who are openly saying they don't believe in the gods, and one of them is Epicurus. But his argument for atheism, which most people don't appreciate, especially the atheists who are excited about Epicurus being an atheist, who say, see, there was atheism. Atheism has a long history. They're like, I bet you don't have the kind of atheism that Epicurus has, because Epicurus's argument about why there aren't gods is that his life will be less troubled if there aren't gods. So therefore there aren't. All of his arguments about what's real and what's not in his writing boil down to, what bugs me, what makes me worry about things. And those ideas I don't like. So I don't believe in those. I like the ideas that involve me being at peace and living a placid life, like calm waters undisturbed by the winds. And whatever ideas allow me to live that way, those are the things I believe in. And Epicurus flat out says it. This is in From Religion to Philosophy by Cornford. He cites this example. He says Epicurus just flat out says, this is why I believe the things I believe and why I don't believe the things I don't believe. So I guess the question is, can you even call it atheism if he doesn't care whether or not they exist? He only cares whether he personally feels.
I don't know. Can I jump in here?
Please.
Yeah. This is just an aside, and maybe we could jot this around for a second or two, just an aside, and maybe not really on the subject matter. But like, what is believing something? If I said I believe in God because it makes me more comfortable and accepting of my death, and it alleviates my fear of my immortality, well, that doesn't make God exist or not. It just makes me comfortable with my death, believing in an afterlife.
Exactly.
And it's kind of like an opposite or reverse Pascal's wager.
Right.
Well, if I don't believe in the gods, if I can somehow convince myself that the gods aren't real, then I can be in my own little play world, because they're not going to judge me for doing all the bullshit that they would judge me for if I did believe in them. And which is the opposite of what the Christian or the religious person says when they say, I will believe in a God because it alleviates my fears of immortality and gets me out of this fear of hell.
Right. Right. Yeah. And Kenneth pokes at these things in this book and in other books. He pokes at these questions of, and he gets some of this from Nietzsche and some of it from Kierkegaard and others, but he pokes at this question of what does it mean to be religious? And one of the where this book focuses is on the idea that to be religious or not religious, what that means is radically different in the ancient world than what it is in the medieval world. Not just different in details, but it's revolutionarily different. It's incompatibly different. And the same is true of the modern world. What does it mean to believe in God in the modern world is radically different than what it believed in than what it meant in the medieval and ancient worlds. And so this question of, when did atheism arise? It partially has to be answered differently in each epoch, because what atheism is or what theism is radically different in each epoch. The example that I had, I have a relative who's a fundamentalist atheist. He's a beehive boy. He likes to put his stick in beehives. And so he's the kind of atheist that wants to go find religious people and see what he can say to upset them. And I've known him my whole life. And he doesn't believe in God. He doesn't believe in the afterlife. He doesn't believe in the soul. Well, all the list of all the things that other people believe in, he doesn't believe in. And I argue it's because they believe in them that he doesn't believe in them. It's because his form of atheism isn't a neutral form of atheism. I've met neutral atheists who are like, well, I'm just not persuaded. He's actively involved, personally, emotionally involved in other people's belief, and he wants to disrupt it. And so the God he doesn't believe in is their God. And when he thinks of God, he accepts all of their premises about what a God is, and then just says no at the end. And that's very different from a scientific investigation of whether there are gods or not and what their nature might or might not be like. So he always talks about the ancients as though they were Christians, as though they all worshipped a Christian God, as though if you prayed to Poseidon, it was like praying to Jehovah. It was pretty much the same thing, but just with a different brand. And I'm having a very hard time getting him to understand that the ancients related to their gods and conceived of them radically differently than the medievals did, or than the moderns do. The thing that we've had the most trouble on is the soul, which of course he doesn't believe in, because that's part of the list of things that, the medievals believe. So I've been pointing out that his issue is that he accepts all of the medieval premises about what the soul is, and then just says no. So when he says he doesn't believe in the soul, he's 99% believes in it, except for the no that he sticks at the end. And the evidence of that is, if you try to talk to him about the ancient concept of the soul, which is totally alien from the medieval concept, the idea that a soul is a useful description of the unconscious life, affirming part of yourself, the part of you that's alive, that the soul is the sum total of the difference between you 1 minute before you die and 1 minute after you die. Everything that's different is the soul. And that's the Greek definition. And so to not believe in the soul is to believe that a corpse is exactly the same as a living person. So what? You're going to have conversations with corpses? You're going to try to have romantic relationships with them? I mean, if you think there's no difference, then sure, that's the behavior I'd expect to see, but that's not what I see. So, there's this issue of, which kind of atheist are we talking about? What is it that they don't believe in? Which do they not believe in parts of nature, like the law of gravity, that are authoritative over us? Now, that's the kind of gods the ancients had. Do they not believe in the medieval transcendental God who's above nature and created nature? Or do they not believe in the modern God, where the modern God could be anything, because there's, everybody can have their own religion. It could mean anything. It's hard to say. But the one thing we can say about it is it's subservient to the global marketplace. It's something that, has to pay its taxes, and you have to, it can only survive if you pour money into it. And, it's become an appendage of the marketplace. Which of these things do we not believe in? And I'm not saying this in order to, be tricky or trip you up. It's just one of the themes that Kenneth Smith has in these books is each of these epochs, the worldview changes so much between one epoch and the next that every single important term, whether it's God or nature or the soul or free will or determinism or philosophy or knowledge, any of these loaded words that carry meaning, their meanings turn inside out. They completely transform. They're just incompatible definitions. So there were ancient atheists, but we wouldn't recognize them. That the kind of atheism they have is very different from a modern atheist. And there were medieval atheists. But again, if we really got to know them, we wouldn't recognize their atheism because it's of a very different nature than modern atheism or ancient atheism. And part of what Kenneth Smith's implying in this book is that these are only three of countless epochs that humanity has gone through. And these are mostly European epochs until the modern age. So there's lots of other worldviews that have been out there before the modern age. And they would have had completely different worldviews with completely different definitions of religion and the gods than even these three. So you're asking a really important question. It's just a very complicated one to answer. I think
it seems like the way one person is asking this question has to do, they're making it subjective as opposed to objective truth. Do you know what I mean?
Kind of, yeah. And it's hard to talk objectively about these things because this is what the point that he's making in paragraph 16 is our ability to be objective about nature is filtered through our own character so intensively that anything that we say, even when we're trying to be objective, is some form of subjectivity.
Right. And like the way the Greek viewed it was, or even, for example, the Nordics, like if you die in battle, and that's a glorious death to them, that's like you go to Valhalla's halls and drink and dine with Odin forever.
Right.
And then, like, for a Greek, if you met your death, no matter how it came, with honor, whether it was in battle or you were sickly or old or you were young, but it was, no matter how it came, if you met it with honor and to the fullest extent of your ability, you could wind up in Elysium, but then you would be, the only way to really overlook your life and say, hey, I had a good life would be to know how you would die.
Yeah.
And the moment after.
Yeah.
But the atheist says there is going to be no moment after. And yes, I don't know the future, and the only moment I have is now. So I have to live an honorable life if that's so is how I choose to live. And I need to figure out how I'm going to live and navigate life because I only get one shot at it.
Yes. Yes. And critical to this is the understanding that the Greek Elysian fields is almost the opposite of heaven. From the medieval heaven and the Greek Elysian fields are almost completely unrelated. And the core of the reason why is that under the medieval concept, you are your soul and your body is just a spacesuit that your soul is inhabiting. It's discardable. And you are the one that goes to hell or heaven afterwards. And your body is cast off like a shell behind you. Paul makes this point several times, but to the ancient Greeks, it was the other way around. You are your body. And when you die and your soul leaves you, you decay. And that's what happens to you. You go back into the ground and become part of the soil. Gaia eats you and you've borrowed your body from Gaia. That's you. And when you die, you go back to Gaia. Your soul was just what animated you and gave you your specific personality and character. And when you exhale the soul goes away from you. Right? The thing that survives in the Elysian fields isn't you. You're dead and rotting. This is the Greek idea. And so, part of this explains why in the Odyssey and other stories where people visit Hades, if they want those spirits in Hades to speak to them, they have to give them at least part of a body. They have to give them blood because the blood can be alive, but the soul can't. The soul's just It's just an animation. It needs an object to animate. It needs a somebody to animate. And so that's why Odysseus gives blood to be able to interview and speak to various spirits of the dead, because those aren't people down there. Those are just psyches. This is such an inside out way of thinking about things. It's really, it takes quite, I mean, probably on first exposure, this isn't quite going to register, but and part of what makes it hard to register is that moderns love the Greek myths, and we tell them over and over in various fictional forms. And in every fictional form, we don't tell the Greek myth, we tell our modern misinterpretation of the Greek myth, because we can't even really conceive of the idea that those aren't like Helen. That's not when Helen's spirit is visited in Hades, we think that somebody's visiting Helen, the real Helen, and their body is, just detritus. We really can't conceive of the idea that Helen's dead. What's that spirit that's being talked to by providing the blood? That's not Helen at all. That's just her dying.
It's just an echo. It's
An echo.
It's kind of like what modern what are they called? Not psychologists, not psychologists, but parapsychologists.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Not every parapsychologist will teach or believe this, but some modern and in former in recent times parapsychologists teach that spirits who are no longer in their body are not actual thinking, intelligent, conscious, coherent awareness, kind of cognitive spirits, just detached and from their body, but rather they're just an imprint and an echo. They can't think, but they can do stuff.
Yeah. So it's interesting, because from a medieval perspective, there's at least two ways that they would say that all the ancients were atheists. Because on the one hand, the medievals say that none of those ancient gods count as gods. So they didn't worship a god. There's only one God, and they didn't worship him. So they're atheists. But even if you set that aside, the fact that they don't believe that the soul is you, and that the soul lives on after death, and that God is concerned with souls and is interested in salvation, they don't believe any of those things. So from a medieval perspective, they're at least doubly atheists. So this is why I'm saying this question is fraught, because it's got these aren't like little details. These are like the whole center of the worldview that we're talking about, and they're just incompatible with each other. They don't fit at all. So it's a great question, and my God, we could write a book on it. It's so juicy. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's been actually a really interesting discussion to hear everybody's comments thus far. One of the things that I found pretty interesting again was that opening line with this private relationship with God. And when you have this private relationship and you're not necessarily being held accountable essentially and by others, feedback, other people's feedback. What that creates is a fragmented understanding of the self. And what happens is you have a set of contradictions that you're trying to resolve, and you're unable to really resolve them in any kind of meaningful way, because that you're really not even you're avoiding a lot of the underlying issues that you're actually facing. So then it just becomes like, again, this is just having a fragmented, like a person that says, well, I don't have that problem, so therefore let me try and resolve it some other way. I don't have a problem, almost like an alcoholic that doesn't admit they have a problem. That would be an example. I mean, it's an extreme example, but let's just say you're prideful. And well, I'm not prideful. And, that lack of feedback and accountability has profound implications within any relationship. And the relationship in the sense that the relationship's no longer genuine. And, it's a lot of times, every time I have a conversation with people, I also say, well, there's a certain degree of authenticity that's actually required in order for you to have a meaningful belief system.
Yes.
And a lot of people will, kind of negotiate and just, join a belief system because it's part of a community.
Yes.
And that negotiation comes with a cost,
Yes.
a really high cost. And that cost is often a result of a certain degree of cognitive dissonance, because at some point you're going to run up against how you actually, what your perception of the world is and what everybody's practicing. And when that same contradiction comes with that personal relationship, that distortion. So this is where the idea of authenticity is so important, right? Because if you're saying you believe in God, then in that particular instance, you're damaging your relationship with your ideal. And so just as you would be damaging your relationship with anyone else. So it's a very interesting way of kind of, or shall I say, evolution of the idea of God. And this one other thing I would just say is the lack of understanding of oneself leads you susceptible to be taken advantage of,
Mm-hmm.
because you're avoiding something.
Mm-hmm.
And in certain cases,
Joe, you digitized there. I think
because and so that avoidance has two it just basically has two costs, the cognitive dissonance and then so sorry.
You broke up there for a bit. You did. So we missed a couple of sentences. Well, we'll come back to you.
Yeah, I'm in and out. I don't know where I left off.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, no worries.
Okay. We'll come back to it. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I would like to kind of reinforce what you said about the Greeks. Somewhere I read a really interesting article. The Greeks had a word. I can't exactly remember. It was like athanesthai or something. It's self-immortalizing, which wasn't dying and go to the Elysian fields. It was, getting your winning of events at an Olympic game carved into a stele or something, becoming part of a poem by Pindar or whatever. That what you wanted. I mean, this is an unusual word in that it's in the middle voice. It's, the active voice is when you do something to something else, and the passive is when something else does something to you, but this middle voice is when you do something to yourself. And so this word is the making oneself immortal by one's actions as a mortal, by great deeds, great accomplishments. It's not that it pretty well precludes that you're going to become immortal by dying. That's, the idea is You become your presence becomes immortal by living, by staying alive in the Greek civilization. And I think that just reinforces what you said about the Elysian fields and, you know, all that stuff. That's not where life took place. Not even when a Greek immortalized himself
Yes.
through his actions.
Yes. Yeah, you can sort of imagine that what the Polises are trying to do with their Polis heroes that they want to make sure everybody in the Polis knows about is they're trying to keep alive the spirit of somebody who represents the virtues they consider most important to that Polis. And what they do by having a guardian divinity like Athena of Athens is just an extreme version of that. The spirit that they're trying to make sure is always present and being thought about is the spirit of Athena. But this is exactly what you're talking about. It's that ancient concept of the spirit being with us, not the medieval concept of the spirit being, you know, literally present. And so it's like these are differences that make a huge difference when we actually start to see the architecture of them. But it's very easy to read right past them because we have different definitions for all these words, except for the one you just said, which our solution to that problem is just to have forgotten the word completely, and now nobody talks about that concept.
Right. Yeah, you don't become immortal by dying and your soul going to live in heaven forever with God.
Right.
You become immortal by having your deeds immortalized by your peers in the city where you lived.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this is we've mentioned it before, but it's worth stressing because it's really relevant here. This is the immortal fame and glory that Achilles is after. He doesn't want to live forever. He's, he knows that's not in the cards for him. Not only is he not going to live forever with a body, he's not going to live forever without a body. He is going to go into the soil and rot like all bodies do because he's a body. This is how the Greeks imagined the self.
Yeah, he's made it 2,500 years.
Yeah, but see, he says, maybe I can live a shorter life, but teach people about courage so effectively that anybody who ever wants to learn about courage is going to talk about my example. And the thing that I want out of it is not that people just say my name, but that I actually contributed. that 2,500 years from now, people will still find it relevant. If they study my example, they'll learn something about themselves and their society that will be of good, that will point humanity towards Sophrosune, right? Maybe Oedipus, his example, he'll live on in infamy, at least from his early days in infamy, but not as a living spirit who's haunting us, but as a daimon that we can be possessed by or fascinated with or study to teach us about the issues that affected him, to try not to repeat his young mistakes. And of course, Sophocles probably would have preferred that we also spent as much time reading Oedipus at Colonna as we did reading Oedipus Tyrannus, so that we could learn the good sides of Oedipus as well, the lessons that he learned. Maybe we could learn those too if we would read the other play and not just spend all our time going, ew, he married his mommy. But we're moderns. We like a spectacle. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I always try to warn people that religion doesn't require a belief in the supernatural or gods. If, for example, you decide that you're going to have a weekly practice on Sunday of going off into the park and meditating, and you go, well, I've got to do that every week. I have to get in tune with myself. That's a practice. That's religion. You don't need to nominate any gods. I keep on trying to warn the modern atheists that word religion just automatically saying, well, that's a belief in a God or whatever. That's not actually the case. You're going to have to come up with something different. More, you'd perhaps talk about the general belief in spirits, or theism is a different level than just a belief in spirits. Theism, the idea of a personal deity. So, well, if you're an atheist, you dispel the idea that there's a deity. You could still believe in spirits technically, because that's what the very word atheism means, is you don't believe in theism. And of course, the atheists prove their religiosity by believing that somehow if we convert everybody to become atheists like us, we'll be in paradise. Yeah, that's religion too, man. Forget it. And this was Max Stirner's big warning about our beliefs. That's a nice spook you got going, man. I like your spook. Tell me another. Stirner, of course, was a type of anarchist. And he reviewed social restrictions as, that's a nice set of spooks you got going there. What do you mean? I always have to open my egg at the small end. What's a demon going to come out and grab me if I don't open my egg at the small end? All your values. You mean if I don't follow your values, my head will explode? That's a nice spook you got going, dude. So moderns are full. This is his point. You're saying you got rid of God. You guys are full of spooks. Sometimes I actually think I would be safer with the believers, because at least they knew what they were talking about.
Yes.
This is a point you were making subtly, weren't you? The believers have actually thought about it.
Mm-hmm.
Have gone over the detail. They're studying their belief. Whereas the atheists believe, oh, you can just dismiss that belief entirely. Okay, you're going to dismiss the belief which has built our culture, as Nietzsche pointed out.
Yes.
The foundations of much of our culture. The whole value system is a spook, man. Yeah, you can talk about facts, scientific facts, but what does that mean to the inner man? What does that mean to our values?
Yes.
The ancients taught a certain set of values, and they had a guarantee. Okay, God created the facts of nature. Equally, God created the values. God's created the starry heavens above to admire the outward beauty, and God also created the moral law within, as Kant would say. Okay, you moderns, you've got to challenge them on this. So yeah, it's we have these beliefs, these old beliefs. These old values are all nonsense. Our values are the truth. And you just go, hey, dude, that's a nice spook you got going there.
Yes. Yes. The belief that one is objective is in some ways the most modern of faiths. And it's also the most incredible. It's just not plausible. And it disregards thousands of years of experience and evidence that we don't see the world exactly the way it is. And the difference between how the world is and how we see it is not petty little details. It's the big stuff that we get wrong. We might be able to get E=mc² right, but we can't put together a coherent government to save our lives. Every government we put together has some significant problems, and you'd think after thousands of years of practice we'd have that part down, but no. And how many failed marriages? It's like, it's simple. Can you get two people to relate to each other effectively over the long haul? And the answer is so often no. I'm objective and I see everything the way it is, but I can't even get two people to relate to each other consistently for a long period of time. I think it's, there's so much counter evidence to the idea that we see the world objectively, that you can see that it must be a matter of pretty strong faith for people to insist that they do see things the way they really are. I went through my rationalist period in my 20s and late teens, and in my experience, life gets a lot easier once we acknowledge the delta that exists between our worldview and the real world. Once we can accept that we have a problem, we can start doing something about it. Because the people who insist, no, I don't have a problem. The world is exactly the way I say it is. These people are a menace.
Of course, remember Crichton's religion in Red Dwarf, that the robots go to heaven. Humans don't go to heaven because they're selfish. Whereas
Yes.
the robots spend their life in selfless devotion to the humans, but they earn the reward of going to heaven.
Yes.
Computer heaven exists, man. He says, and they go, well, why do you believe in that? Well, where are all the little computer chips going to go?
That's right.
But humans, you don't go to heaven. We all laugh about it. Us robots, we're laughing our heads off when the humans think they're going to heaven. How can such a corrupt set of beings, selfish beings, ever go to heaven?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, Red Dwarf. They did a good job with a number of issues, didn't they? Putting them into high relief. So all this discussion that we're doing in paragraph 16 and about paragraph 16, we're really exploring around these issues of public and private, and to what extent are we free in our choices? To what extent are we not free? And does the state have a vested interest in helping us to overcome the worst of our self-centered idiocies, or should it just let us do whatever we want and pray that somehow a society comes out as a result? Aristotle's line is, you get a bunch, if you extend the franchise to everybody and everybody gets a say and everybody votes, you still don't have a good government. Not until the people are good. The people have to be healthy and want the right things. Otherwise, they're just voting for some kind of sickness. And if a lot of them are sick, the sickness they vote for will win. It'll be the majority opinion. What you need is people with sophrosune. And developing sophrosune is the hardest thing for people to do. Maybe it's possible to make a society where everybody has enough sophrosune, that having a universal franchise on all major issues is the right solution. But Lord, we haven't seen one yet. It's tough to get people to think outside their ideologies and their appetites. So this is why the Greeks think that religion is a political issue. They're government. They see government and daimon and ethos as directly related to each other. And the only mediator is the issue of sophrosune. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, between the public and private, since our relationship with God is a private matter, according to the medievals, I want to ask a question about Martin Luther and the Reformation. Why is it called a Reformation, reforming, rather than a reorientation or recuperation of the original? It seemed like Martin Luther was trying to recuperate what was lost, rather than the reform. I guess he's reforming what had become, but shouldn't it be called recuperation? Why is it called Reformation? I mean, because that was the original relationship between man and God, private, rather than the Catholic Church has made it into a public relationship. So, yeah, I mean, would he have been more successful to say we are really the authentic Christians, or trying to recuperate the authentic religion rather than reform what has fallen? So I just want to ask that, because that seems like a very strange way to put it.
Yeah. Yeah, I bet there is a lot behind Martin Luther's choice of words there. The word that came to my mind, I was just reading about typefaces and the origin of the Garamond typeface and the numerous attempts to create Garamond typefaces that actually turn out not to be Garamond at all.
Yeah, well, the real Garamond, please stand up.
Well, the real Garamond, please stand up, right? I mean, it's hilarious how many non-Garamond Garamonds there are, and the terminology that people use now when they're trying to create an authentic Garamond, like Robert Slimbach did in 2005 with his Garamond Premier, is revival. They use the word revival. We're trying to bring it back to life. We're reviving it. And certainly in the 19th century in the United States, revival was the word everybody was using for their get-togethers, where they're saying we want to go back to the origins of Christianity and recreate the authentic religion.
Well, the thing with Garamond, though, I mean, the mistake was historical, because what happened was Cardinal Richelieu had, in a sense, put away actually a post-Garamond type. It was named Garamond. It came from the vault, the French vault, whatever it was, and it seemed like, well, that's got to be the authentic Garamond, but it turned out it wasn't.
Right.
Until
yes,
Beatrice Way discovered that was not the right one.
Yeah, and it's telling, because I mean, as complex, anybody who really gets into typography comes to understand how complex it is, the design of a typeface, and yet by comparison with a religion, it's a simple thing. And even with reviving a typeface, we can get into enormous amounts of trouble. It's likewise when we're trying to read Aristotle. To what extent can we revive his intentions and figure out what he's talking about? It's like, well, it's dicey. We get a lot of it wrong. Passion, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I just wanted to go back and say one quick thing about what Stephen was saying about Elysium, and also the idea of Hades, about the shades. And you're only when you're in Hades, you're only in the underworlds, you're only, and you're talking with the shades. You're only getting facts from them. You're not getting any identity. You're only getting the facts. You're only getting memory. No identity, no purity of identity. And it's just an echo. It's just a fragment. It's just almost a figment of some. It's hardly even imagination, really, because since they don't have any of their identity or any identity to speak of, they have no imagination to speak of. They only have memory. And Achilles said, "I'd rather be a slave up there than a shade down here." Mm-hmm. And I think that really betrayed that truth, that what they were trying to convey with this concept of that there was no identity in the underworld, that their body goes back to Gaia and it's just an echo. Because if it's just an echo, how could Achilles say, "I'd rather be a shade, I'd rather be a slave up there than a shade down here"? He had to know what the torment of being a shade felt like, and so he had to have in that saying, the author was imbuing some form of identity into Achilles, mm-hmm. rather than just echo and memory and facts, because he knew what his punishment and sorrow felt like, and he could express it. However, I've heard it taught to me, and this could be wrong. This could be wrong, Rick, and please, or Steve, tell me if this is wrong, or Phil. I heard it said in a class one time that Elysium is where you get to truly retain everything about your identity. Your identity just isn't an echo; it's your true self, because that's what you've gained from the gods.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could add the idea that when we talk about the Greek religion, we're talking about something that existed for at least a couple thousand years in some form or another. And some of those years overlapped with the rise of Christianity, and there's a period that the historian of philosophy Brehir wrote a series of volumes about the history of philosophy, and he makes a sharp distinction that Kenneth Smith makes as well between the Hellenic age and the Hellenistic age. He says, once you get to the conquest by Macedonia and the rise of Philip and Alexander and the Alexandrian Empire, that Macedonian Greece, even though in some ways it's a golden age for Greece because they're relatively united and they're able to spread across Europe and Asia and Africa in a way that the Roman Empire would do later on. Despite that, it's not the Greeks at all. It's not Greek culture at all. It's another culture for whom Greek culture is their brand, but in many ways, the way they live their lives and believe in their deities has changed profoundly, and they really are a different people who doesn't understand how different they are. So the issue that, and of course, then we get the Romans later on, who invent the concept of Greco-Roman in their attempt to borrow prestige from Greek intellectuals by claiming that what the Romans believe is the same as what the Greeks believe, which it totally isn't. And so they coin Greco-Roman, and all of this comes down to us in a great mash together as kind of a blur. And so when we're looking back and trying to say, well, what did the Greeks believe about Elysium? Our problem is that there's a lot of different people at different periods who are saying different things about Elysium, and many of those things are contradictory. And some of those contradictions occasionally happen at the same time from people disagreeing, but frequently the disagreements are happening between people who live centuries apart from each other, and they're really in different stages of the ancient epoch and its decay. So by the late period of the ancient epoch, that sense of duty and response, that duty and freedom to manage your ethos has fallen away under a kind of fatalism, to some extent under the Macedonian, which is why the Alexandrians are inventing, or let's say popularizing astrology, because they want to use the stars to calculate whether you have a eudaimon or a dysdaimon. And then whatever they calculate, they say like, well, you're stuck with it. Too bad. If you got a dysdaimon, you're unlucky. I guess your life will suck. So they've like shifted out of a responsible mode into a fatalistic mode. And likewise, their hopes start to become more otherworldly as they sort of lose hope for being able to change this world to make it the way they want. The more they start leaning into the afterlife, hoping that that's where they can finally have the life that they want, even if they can't have it here. So this transformation happens over time. So what Elysium means to these guys, it depends on which period you're talking about. It's a good question. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Very good to see everybody. Yeah, first highlight of the week. I'm glad to be here, and I'm sad I missed last week, but live in the moment. And then second, I want to say I'm really enjoying, if he doesn't mind me calling him out a little bit, giving a little praise, maybe feeding his ego, hopefully not unleashing a kraken, that Stephen, it's been really nice to hear you essentially give lovely soliloquies, and also a little bit of teasing or teaser of like your other talks about some other venue or talking about religion and whatnot. I would be very interested in hearing you speak more about these things. I really enjoy your vast knowledge and your specifically narrow opinion, as are all of our opinions are very narrow, but you have a unique perspective that's really insightful. I'd like to just, if I were to characterize you a little overly reductive, it's that you seem to be really focused on almost like you're a customs agent, getting all the smuggled baggage that everybody brings into their ideas. You like, oh, you smuggled this idea in. You thought you were bringing just this bag, but look at all that extra stuff in there. So I really, really like that, because I find that's generally my biggest angle when being critical or examining these things, is getting the layer of all the smuggled baggage we have underneath. So I would love to, in general, Stephen, I would encourage you, if you don't mind, not take over, but playfully take over this group a little bit more and share more of your ideas with longer. Like usually you speak like a minute or two, but here you speak like 5, or even just tell us you can give us a 10-minute beautiful lecture. I'm going to be just eating the most delicious meal ever of your word feast. so to speak, something like it's similar to Rick. I love Rick. You go on and teach. It's very nice. It's my biggest criticism that I learned from one of my parents is talking about newspapers. My dad would often complain that they're a constipation of thought, but a diarrhea of words, or a constipation of content and a diarrhea of words. And so I find that I really like it both here, that there's a feast of words, but there's also an even greater feast of meaning and actual content in there. It's not just the sophistry that oftentimes we're really trying to make sure we're getting away from, rhetoric just for rhetoric's sake. That also, to honor Sharon, I'm going to go back to the text and actually make, I don't know, I almost feel like Kenneth is too smart for this, but he seems to be making a big mistake on the surface, so we'll have to dive into this. It says, this paragraph 16, only other people studying dispassionately the oblique evidence of one's general course of actions and drift of life could make an determination, he says, only after one's life is safely over is it possible to say decisively whether it was governed by a good or a wholesome daimon. And to me, this is nonsense. That's its own internal problem. You've got these other people looking at someone's life and seeing the outcome of the life from a very external point of view, when he's making this whole case that a whole life is both what's internal and external. So how are these people who are just on the outside going to give any sort of completion to the internal life? And I give a good example of, let's say you have an abusive father who abuses his children, and he looks like he's a total monster, but he, to some degree, privately believes inside that he knows he's an abusive monster because his father was an abusive monster, and he's actually learning to, let's say, if his dad beat him, on a level of 10, he only beats his kid on a level of 3. And so this is a huge victory in terms of character growth and ethos and character development. That he's, it's like the guy you're judging, this thief, for stealing stuff. But what if the thief, got a model from his dad that the thief was both a thief and a murderer, and he's not a murderer anymore. He's just a thief, and he's worked his whole life to not murder. So he's just stealing. From that internal perspective, that is a totally different transvaluation of values, where you could say that this person is quite the hero. Or similar, you could have the opposite, very easily the exact opposite. This person's a righteous person that does all these wonderful things, but his dad was like 10 times more righteous, and he's fallen by the wayside, and he's on the path to degradation. Like, oh, that guy's such an honorable guy. But in his internal narrative is, I'm just vain, and I'm doing all this righteous stuff so that I can be vain. So, lacking the inside is just as dangerous as lacking the outside. And ironically, being an other person from the outside, the one thing you do really get after someone's dead, you can see after they're dead what things appear like, and you can sort of recreate or transform the journey that person was taking, but you have no access to the internal journey that person was taking. And so to me, this only works if the people are on the outside of reading the autobiography from this guy at the same time, or even still the autobiography only gives what's revealed to the internal terror, but the internal, like we're saying with the daimons, most of the daimons are not revealed to the inner world as well, right? So this inner world has an inner world that's hidden, and the outer world has an inner world that's hidden. So there's all these hidden aspects to say that one can decisively, this is very strange language to hear, Kenneth say, what is possible to say decisively whether, I just get so is he being sarcastic here? What's he doing? This doesn't seem at all like what he's doing before. So to me, I have a big red flag or question mark or something really odd is going on in this sentence, because it seems too reductive. It's like a certain aspect of Kenneth is throwing out the rest of Kenneth.
Yes. He does that
I
from
think
time.
that's okay. I was gonna say this is a good place to stop. I think I summed everything else. And yeah, Stephen, I want to hear more from your beautiful mind. So yeah.
Thank you for that, Ari. He's Kenneth is doing his best in the linear format of an essay to represent his ideas, but he's mortal and his best is never going to be enough. There's going to be sentences where he's right on the money and he's captured a paradox and a dialectic in a way that really draws it to our attention and makes us understand it. And then there's moments when he's thinking the dialectic, but he doesn't write the dialectic. And this is one of those moments, right? I mean, I'm sure if we had Kenneth on this conversation and we asked him about it, he would absolutely agree. There has to be a dialectic between the internal and the external in understanding character. Other people can see some parts of character, and a person can see other parts of character. And of course, what neither of them knows is which parts of what they're seeing is accurate and which parts are inaccurate. So if they try to get together and put a picture together, they're just as likely to accidentally throw out all the accurate parts and only end up with each person's contribution of inaccuracies as they are to put the accurate parts together. It's a mortal thing, right? Mortals trying to understand is always fraught with challenge. But in general, you could hope that the dialectic would have a greater chance of getting more of the truth than if we just settle on the outside or the inside.
Well, I want to ask a question. Consider, we never talk about this, but like, Kenneth being a person, is he maybe being funny and just one of these guys who's telling a joke, but maybe he doesn't even know he's telling a joke? Like, he's so dry or whatever. Like, what's going on? There's something to me. There's something that changed. If like we're looking at his brain under like an fMRI and he's writing this sentence versus other sentence, different parts of his brain are active here than others. And I'm just curious, like, is there some sort of pattern or like, humor or sarcasm or just like, you're saying there's something else, but I feel like it's not just so surface that this happens to be a coincidence where he's just not being dialectic. To me, that's too simple. Maybe that's true, but I'd like to believe there's something else going on, and I'm just curious what that is.
Well, for sure, the man has a sense of humor, and he's often grinning when he's writing. He finds a lot of this stuff funny. But the other thing, what I've noticed as a pattern that happens in Kenneth sometimes is he's driving towards a different point, but he feels like he has to observe this point along the way, and because of that, he doesn't give this point the due diligence that he would have given it if this was the thing he was focusing on. That's where I most frequently see him not be dialectical when he would normally intend to be dialectical. But why don't we see what Sharon and Donald have to add about this? So Sharon, go ahead.
Well, Rick, could you just expound on this? Because I think the sentence that follows this up, where he says, in his trial for impiety, Socrates appealed to this anonymous daimon that spoke directly to him and did not impel him to act, but intervened only to deter him from acting. Socrates' daimon seemed closer to the Christian concept of conscience, a private forum with God. So I think just taking that one sentence in isolation, I think we kind of missed the point. And I think Kenneth enlarged on that, whether it's accurate or not. So I want you to expound on that. Thank you.
I think you're right, Sharon. For sure, he doesn't intend that second sentence to stand alone by itself. He's gluing together the first sentence with these sentences 3 and 4. He's trying to lead up to this idea that in general there is this dialectic of private and public associated with the daimon, but when we get to the age of Socrates, when we're deep into the logos age, or as Stephen would say, the axial age, we're starting to see a different conception of the daimon than the original one. And so, and he continues that, by the way, in sentences 5 and 6 at the end of this paragraph, when he says, and by the time we get to Christian, it's moved even further in that direction of being a private thing instead of a public thing. So it's why he's emphasizing the public in sentence 2, is to set up the contrast with sentences 3 and 4. If you were to try to, if you were to say to Kenneth, let's have a whole seminar, let's just spend 3 hours talking about public versus private, in religion and the daimon, he would express it as a dialectic. And here it's just, the problem is, how does he keep the arrow of the conversation pointing ahead to sentences 3 and 4? I think you're right, Sharon. It's meant to be part of the larger whole and not to stand by itself.
Can I restate what you're saying, Rick? It was very nice that I realized was very healthy. Kenneth, he's having a dialogue. If he starts having a dialogue with something else, that means he loses the current dialogue. So he has to stay narrow and rigid on the peripheral things that are also dialogues. But if he engages in them, he loses the center. And so he only can really maintain one dialogue at a time, or else he loses us.
Yes. I think that's well put. And I have that. I'm pretty sure he's doing that because I have that exact same struggle on every one of these calls. So I'm sort of working us through. I'm doing something a little different than what Kenneth's doing, but I too am trying to work us through the text. But in the course of that, I recognize I have to give more space for us to explore the associations, the linkages, the other lines that people bring in. But in the course of doing that, I'm always in my mind listening to people while also thinking, how does this lead us back to the text, or does it lead us back to the text, or are we going to finish paragraph 16 this week, and things like that. So there's a certain amount of pruning that has to happen in the justice that we do to the issues that get raised in our attempt to kind of focus the growth in the direction of the main point that we're trying to arrive at. So I think you're right, Ari. Donald, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
I think Kenneth is echoing a kind of a Greek little aphorism attributed, if my Google foo is right, to Solon: count no man happy before he's dead. I mean, that recurs in Greek writing for, certainly after Solon wrote it. That was, and I don't know, what does it mean? You can't judge how good a man has been until he's no longer a man. He's lived it out, his life. I don't know that there's anything here other than, you need to make the judgment after you've seen everything, or everything has become as visible as it's going to be.
Yeah. You're right. I mean, it's sort of, that saying is, you're right, in absolute currency in that period. And that question of, you would have thought Oedipus happy up until a certain point. It's like,
Exactly.
until the rest of the story emerges, you don't know what story you're in. Yeah.
Who knows? Richard Nixon could have died in 1968 or something.
Right.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know that there's something. He's if anything, he's trying to get us to think more deeply about the meaning of a common aphorism.
Yeah.
Greek one that there, and I'll just let other people think.
Yeah, I mean, to try to get us to focus on the whole picture and not a piece of it, he's having to cut away the focus on the dialectic and instead put the focus on incompleteness versus completeness. What's the rest of the story? Are we really looking at the whole thing here? And of course, the problem is, an individual won't be able to look back on his entire life because it isn't entire until he's dead. So he'll never have the opportunity to sit back and go, well, here's the whole picture. He may have most of the picture, but never going to have the whole picture because at that point he's dead. There's a lot of related issues kind of woven in here. And I think you've underscored the most important thing about this, which is that his goal isn't to provide an answer. It's to get us to think about this stuff deeply, more deeply than we have. And, even this discussion about, has he said this exactly right? Are there things he's missing? This is us actually doing what he wants us to do, which is, chew on these issues, dig into these issues. And he doesn't want to be anybody's prophet or systematizer. He just wants to stir up things that have been overlooked. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, so I mean, I appreciate what's actually being, kind of, shared here, especially, about how capturing the incompleteness part, and how he has to kind of, in a way, kind of capture, that specific sentence as if the whole was actually being, correctly assessed. But I mean, what I always think is that, like, what's the alternative to the sentence? And I think that that's how you really have to view that. And if you actually were to view the alternative, then it would be what? Less data is better. I mean, or that less feedback is better. And I'm not saying all feedback's equal, and that, yes, we need to have people around us that actually have an understanding of reality, and that their perversion of reality can have an impact on on how we look at ourselves, and it's very hard to judge one's relative journey, the relative progress that they've made over time. So I'm in agreement with that. But I think that, if you're looking at it, it's more about this personal and private kind of contradiction that's being captured. And that's really the core. And how do you then, what's the, addressing that is the main part of the point that he's making. So I think he actually does make it, even though there is an element of incompleteness to it. And he does capture it to a certain degree. We also have to think about it in the terms of the limits of language itself. I mean, the limits of language to capture what he was trying to articulate could be a little misleading, but anyway, those are just some of my thoughts. Part of it, I would say, is that on the other side of it is as far as making a judgment on somebody else's life, whether or not it's been good or not, that's something that I think that's not something we should do in general, because we don't know what their journey is. So anyway.
Yeah, that goes back to Ari's point, and it's a good one. And in a way, it underscores McDonald's focus, which is, if the goal is to look at the whole picture, if that's what Kenneth's trying to say that they ought to be doing here, as long as we don't have the whole picture, we have to be cautious in our judgments, don't we? I mean, taking information out of context, we render it into noise. So I think of my own father's journey from the 70s, when he was a raging alcoholic and was, spanking us with, belts and bamboo and hairbrushes and other things, when he wasn't running over our cats or feeding us rotting food. And he turned that around. He turned it around. He climbed out of the bottle and made himself not a practicing alcoholic anymore. And he did the reading to figure out where he'd gone wrong in his parenting. And he became a better person than he had been before. And that really underscores Ari's point. This issue of things that look good can turn bad. It has its converse as well. Things that look bad can turn good, or as imperfect as they are, they might still be a whole lot better than where they started out. I look at my own family's changes generationally over time, and you can see all these flawed people who are nevertheless so much better than their parents were. In some of these families where people are crawling up out of domestic violence and incest and alcoholism and all of these just generational plagues. And you see these new generations that, yeah, they did a few bad things, but my God, compared to their parents, they're saints. And the whole picture is a sort of underscoring sentence to the whole picture might require looking at more than a lifetime. You might have to look at many lifetimes within a family line to see the changes that have been happening. So, this is sometimes how this is what Hegel encourages us to do with his approach to history, and in that he's trying to recapture the Greek idea of look at it generationally, look at the epochs, look at the change over time, the growth and decay, and sometimes it changes our judgments, about where we would come down. But I mean, the goal would not be to until the late Hellenistic and Roman period, the goal wouldn't be to pigeonhole people into good or bad, or their daimon into good or bad. The goal is to learn about sophrosune. This is to Aristotle. This is everything. It's the whole game. The whole game is we don't have sophrosune. All the organisms but us have sophrosune. We need to learn how to patch together the closest approximation of sophrosune we can. And that means we got to study people. We got to be anthropologists and psychologists, and we need to study people and figure out how does character lead to behavior, and how does that in turn lead to the character of a polis. So how can we do better tomorrow than we did yesterday? And that's really what all this is really driving towards. Phil, what's on your mind?
Well, isn't a problem to try to capture an organic living system in linguistics, in words as frozen? I mean, maybe that's why Socrates refused to write anything because in the conversation things changed and the dynamic in a sense. Now, I want to describe a writing project I did. First of all, I want to describe that I'm not a great writer. I mean, I wish I was, but I wasn't a great writer. I try to write something about my artist statements. And as I discover in the process of writing, I finally came to a point where I revised it so many times. And as I revised it, I realized there was a problem in the writing itself. In other words, as I revised it, I changed one word and it changes other words, the meaning. And when I changed those, I changed the other words. It got so complex that I actually, at some point, I started writing all the words that changed and describing it at that moment. And then I go to the next one and I make another glossary of that one and that one and that one. And at the end, it just got too complex for me to do because when I look at it, and this is why it's a very radical process. I wish I was a better writer. I could actually deal with it. It was like looking into a deep well with all these words floating around. It's like they're unstable, they're dynamic, and I can't seem to solidify them in a way. Which seems to me, if you could write like that, which is sort of like a much more fluid, a word that in some ways is not prose, but is kind of poetic, then in a sense, maybe it allows things to emerge because part of the important thing about it is that the hidden stuff has to come out, and when you freeze it, it's already turned into an object, into a statement rather than a question that evolves. And so in some sense, I wish I was a better writer so I could have made that in a way so that in a sense people begin to understand that the only way you could really write in that way is to create something that is sort of a groundless, flexible thing in which the reader has to penetrate and find a new meaning in it in some way. And so it almost seems like it's a failed project from the beginning to describe what is a changing process.
Yeah. It's hard, isn't it?
Well, that's why we talking about it makes it dynamic,
Yes.
And in some sense, maybe he should have written it in such a way that we understand. You're not really supposed to understand it until you talk about it.
Yeah, yeah. It's why talking to Kenneth is such a blast because you react directly to the things you're saying, and you can have give and takes. I'm trying to simulate a tiny fragment of that as best I can for everybody. This thing, I'm going to call on Ari in a second, but sentences 3 and 4, I really want to underscore this. In his trial for impiety, Socrates appealed to his anomalous daimon. In other words, a daimon very differently from the way most Greeks imagined the daimon to work, right? He appealed to his anomalous daimon that spoke directly to him. This is the opposite of what most Greeks believe a daimon is. So you can imagine that most people who grew up with Plato's dialogues and reading about Socrates will get if they think that that's representative of the Greek concept of a daimon, they'll get a very skewed picture of what the Greeks believed. Because in fact, the whole trial is about the fact that Socrates doesn't believe what most of the Greeks believe about the daimon. He believes his daimon is different. Says, but intervened only to deter him from acting. So he says, Socrates' daimon seemed far closer to the Christian concept of conscience, or we might say a guardian angel, right? A private forum with God, than to anything his contemporaries could recognize as moral essence. They disbelieved his claims of piety accordingly, which is how he got in trouble. Now, to underscore this, I want to share something that just occurred to me while Phil was talking. Based on what he was saying, I was thinking about Fusus cryptostai philae is Heraclitus's Nature Loves to Hide. And we've said before that nature includes both. When the Greeks talk about nature, they make clear repeatedly that they mean both the outer nature and the inner nature, your ethos. they use the same pun in Greek that we have in English. Your nature also refers to your character, right? Just like it refers to nature, itself and the general laws and the location. And we know from, I can't remember if it's Thales or somebody else who said, we talked about this when we were doing chapter 4, phusis is to cosmos as psyche is to somos. Somos is the body and psyche is the soul. So everything we said before about the soul and the body, you imagine, well, what if the universe, if the cosmos is also an organism like our somos, then phusis is its animating spirit, its ethos, its intelligence, its life, right? Everything that distinguishes it from being dead. So when he says nature loves to hide, we know Heraclitus loves puns, loves them, right? He's constantly trying to squeeze more meaning into a few words by making little references. And so since he has equated nature with ethos and nature and phusis with nature and phusis with cosmos, it therefore follows that when he says nature loves to hide, he's also saying ethos loves to hide. It's difficult, and that's borne out by his other fragment that says you couldn't discover the limits of your soul even if you traveled for your entire lifetime, such as its profundity. It's a deep, complex subject. So your ethos loves to hide when it comes to understanding your ethos. And because nature also includes the cosmos, which is the larger nature that we organisms are a part of and create through our relationships, he's also saying, and this never occurred, I got the ethos connection before, but until Phil was talking, I didn't get the cosmos connection. He's also saying the whole loves to hide. It is very hard to figure out the whole story, the whole picture, because from where we are, we can only see part of it, right? I mean, that's why the nature around us is not something that we ever get to have the final word on, because we never get to see most of it. We only see the tiny bit that we intersect in our lives. So this goes back to what Ari, I'm doing this before I call on Ari, because this goes back to what Ari was saying earlier about the whole picture. Somebody may look like a terrible person until you see the whole picture and go, wow, they have come a long way. Yeah, he stopped murdering people. He's actually helping, other than the thieving. This guy's, got a lot going for him by comparison to where he was in his 20s. We have to salute the progress, because, that was hard fought. And most of us who might seem to be better people never worked for our goodness the way that he worked to get rid of so much worse badness in himself. These issues that I think it's alluded to here in Phusis Cryptus Thae Philae, and I never realized that until today. So thank you, Phil. This is going to change the way I think about this fragment and put together Heraclitus's stuff. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, mostly just pondering some of the things Phil has said, and it's more of a mythology or a nice story, which I'm thinking here is that in general, the universe or reality or life makes space for us to live by relinquishing a certain amount of control. And that's the nature of this creative process, that when you're like, I feel like there's the microcosm of the whole universe in Phil's trying to write, and then changing one word changes every other word, which then he has to, it's an endless process of, and he can only change one word directly, but indirectly he changes all the words. So every attempt to change a word is this endless process of actually creating more chaos in the midst of trying to make more order. And so it's like this very much this broken process. So you can't control. If you're trying to do a creative endeavor and the whole purpose is just to control everything, it doesn't work. Creation is this weird partnership or palentropy. I like that idea. If I'm making a mistake, palentropy is essentially a paradox in relationship or something, where you have two things that are contradicting each other but are also bringing each other into existence.
Yes.
Right. So they're through their negation, they actually make each other. Yeah, they negate each other's negation. That's a weird idea. But with writing and with Phil and being creative, it's this recognition, number one, of trying to control something, but then letting go of control about everything else. Like, and I was thinking this is the way it works to like us being created. Let's say if there is a God or just a universe that created us by making space for us, then we can honor it by making space for it in our lives. So we reduce ourselves. And this is also the nature of how we relate to others. Then primarily this is modeled through a way a parent shouldn't, or in my philosophy, doesn't own their child, but they're their own individual creation, and your job is to sort of curate that process. But you shouldn't think of yourself as, I think the Roman idea, patria potesta, that you own your child and that you're the ownership of your whole family, in fact, and therefore to kill them or to offer them up as sacrifices is within your legal framework. But if I don't own my children, in this case, I'm oftentimes making them space so that they can become their own person, right? I have to, if I try to control everything that they do, it fails entirely. If I try to control nothing, it fails entirely. But if I can try to control maybe some of the environment in which they live and the principles which they hold, and hopefully and then I give them the opportunity to make their own choices in certain ways and learn. And so for me, this is like the ideal of the creative process, where there's very much trying to figure out exactly how much I should control. I guess that's agency, how much I should let be to try and cultivate my agency, and other things are just accept contingency. And like where that, almost like a wave or a string or a whole bunch of strings and musical instruments playing all at once, like I don't know where any of that stuff begins or ends. I'm just trying to go along with it. But I know for sure that I'm not trying to stop playing and I like let go of everything and do nothing. And I'm supposed to not do the opposite and try to do everything. There's like some sort of middle ground.
Yes. 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 Yeah. These are really interesting subjects. The palintropy comes from Heraclitus's line. He has a fragment that says, "People do not understand how that which is at variance with itself also agrees with itself." And the second sentence of it says, "There is a harmony in the bending back, as in the case of the bow and the lyre." And the bending back is palintropos. And that's his attempt to capture the idea that conflicting forces don't have to be destructive. You can wield the conflict to harness them to each other so that you create a dynamic system. Like in the body, I always go back to the insulin and the glucagon, where one is trying to tell the cells you have to take blood sugar out of the blood and lower the blood sugar level. That's the insulin. And the glucagon says, no, now is the time when the blood sugar is too low. I need the cells to release blood sugar back into the blood and raise the blood sugar level. And glucagon and insulin are opposites to each other, but the body harnesses them together into a pair of systems that between them, by having this tension back and forth like a bow or a lyre, it can create a healthy sophrosune around blood sugar. And the body is completely constructed around systems like these. They're all palintropies, one after another, to keep you from not going too far one way, but also not going too far the other way, to resist, as the vicissitudes of contingency push on you this way and that way. Living systems have to be able to go with the flow, but also then push back and prevent themselves from being shoved into.
Have you read Donella Meadows? You're into the somaticity thing, but have you heard of Donella Meadows? She's, in my opinion, not that I'm an expert here, but just my calling and my little understanding. I'm smart enough to recognize those that are like really, really smart sometimes. Like I'm smart enough to see, like I'm a good enough painter to recognize really, really good skill. Donella Meadows, or Dana Meadows, is oftentimes thought of as the mother of systems thinking. And she has a book called Thinking in Systems. And what you're describing is very much what she describes in a very profound language. So I was thinking you might really enjoy adding to your depth of knowledge to this by thinking of her descriptions, because her descriptions are really spectacular.
I would love to. Donella Meadows. And here's
It's also a really short book. It's so great. It's so short. It's like a Mark's pamphlet or a certain type of Bible. It's so short, but it's got so full of everything that's juicy.
I love it when people can write juicy like that. You can chew on it for the rest of your life. Thanks. I'll follow up with that. Passion, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, you hit the nails right in the coffin, I should say. Wait, switch that, reverse it. I got it all wrong. Switch to something else. We all know what I'm talking about. At any rate, when you were saying, Rick, about, I can't remember exactly how you put it, but what I was going to say was this idea that there has to be a certain juxtapositioning with this with the Greek concept of that you have to go with the flow of the river so as not to get caught up in the current and drowned. Yet you have to know how to swim. You've got to know how to swim, when to go up the stream, when to go down it. You've got to know when the rock is falling so you can get out of its way so you don't fucking die and get hit in the head and die. And it's all about knowing when to move and how to move, and then also knowing when to let go and just be. But then also Ari, you can comment on that, Rick or Steven or whoever. But also Ari, me and Rick, I wanted that might talk to me for a minute or two after with the meeting, because I wanted to talk to him a couple of different things, heads up on some stuff that's coming down the pike. But I'm an artist as well, freelancer, and if you want and have the time, I'd like to talk to you about some ideas for mixed mediums and some artistic not ability, but just mixed mediums. So if you have some time, do you think you could stick around?
I can definitely stick around a little bit longer, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I can stick around for a few minutes and we can exchange contact info.
Cool.
And then we've got
What did
Phil.
do you have anything to say about my comment, Rick?
So I mean, I liked it, but my brain moved on to your question of whether we could stay, behind afterwards, and because I only have 7 ± 2 registers in my brain, it then threw out what you said at the beginning part, and I've forgotten.
Oh no, I said, sorry, Phil, I'm cutting you off. I feel like I'm cutting you off. I said like the Greek concept because of going with the flow. You had to go with the flow. You had to go with the flow.
Yes.
And I'll add a little on here. You had to go with the flow because the flow was always what the gods, not just what they wanted of you, but what they demand, and it's not just what they wanted or expected, but of what they commanded and demanded.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for the reminder. Now I remember what you said.
Yeah. You want to comment?
So yeah, I mean, it's one of the interesting things about ancient Greek polytheism is that it didn't promote a simple-minded view of the world. It didn't promote a view of the world that would lend itself readily to simple answers. Because if you've got only a single God, he can get his story straight and tell you what he wants, and you just have to do what he wants. But if you have a whole pantheon of deities, and to the Greeks, it's 12 is just the beginning, it's potentially an infinite number of deities, then you have a much more difficult time getting to the truth. It requires a lot more creative intelligence to wrestle with it because nobody's giving you the whole picture. Zeus is not Yahweh, and he's not Jesus either. He's not giving you a clear, coherent picture of what you're supposed to do or how you're supposed to behave. He's just talking about the nature, of fire, of lightning, of authority, whereas Poseidon is giving you something about the nature of water. And Hades is giving you something about the nature of cold air and so forth. Each of these, they're not creator deities who transcend the cosmos and dictate terms. They're more immanental deities who are attempting to convey how they're trying to make understandable to human beings how that part of nature works, and that you need to pay attention to it. So Nietzsche summed this up by saying, no Greek god ever told a Greek thou shalt. The Greek gods weren't in the habit of giving commandments. They're like, hey, if you want to disregard, nature, then nature will run you over, and that's fine. There's always more people. You want to be a mouse in the grass ignoring the elephants dancing around. Well, we know how that's going to end. You're going to end up a little squished mousy. But if you want to pay attention, then the Greek gods are here to try to convey to you, one each to talk about their issue. But you have to do the work to put the whole picture together, and that means resolving all these contradictions. On the one hand, and it's like in physics. On the one hand, gravity, and on the other hand, electromagnetism. And many of the things at our scale of existence are subject to both at the same time. And that's not even getting into the strong and weak force. So you have this sort of intersectionalism going on in the explanations where you're required to put it all together. And it's not in the form of commandments. But what it does do is I appreciate your use of the word compel. It's sort of, there's a demand here, an implicit demand that you have to develop your own understanding and experience to rise to the level of being able to handle paradox and contradiction as a natural part of reality. We're not going to get a tidy, clean explanation with no contradictions. Instead, we're going to end up with a cosmos that's so full of paradoxes and palintropies that it's like we're not walking on solid ground anymore. We're just walking across a field of paradoxes. And that's what the Greeks expect us to be able to handle, and the Greek gods by extension as well. It is a very different relationship between the sacred and human beings if we're expected to kind of grow up mentally and handle those kinds of difficult situations. So I guess that's my quick 2-minute response. But obviously the issues you're raising we could talk about for 3 hours. I mean, it's juicy stuff. So we'll let Phil have the last word, and then we'll wrap up for this week. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I want to share with you a violinist I've been following since he was 8 years old. I want to pay attention to her. Her name is Hamari Yoshiwara. And she has this talent of, even at 8 years old, understanding the music internally. Because there's a lot of child musicians who are technically very proficient, but don't really have an inner voice. And I just recently heard her play this very complicated, almost contradictory violin concerto. I think it's by Wasanowski. It's a very complex one. And the thing is, when you play a concerto, you have a very interesting relationship between yourself, the conductor, and the orchestra. So that's almost like a cosmos, okay, in a way. And there was a part in which the orchestra was playing it differently. And she insisted by playing, no, you got it wrong. She insisted on playing it this way, and the orchestra harmonized with her. And they realized she was right. She was only 13 years old now when she did that. It's amazing how a 13-year-old had the command of the music internally, technically proficient, but also had, in a sense, is the dynamism to, in a sense, insist that the orchestra was playing it wrong because they were playing a certain way, and she played it in a way, and they had to follow her in the right way. There was a time when she was 9 years old, she was playing, I think it might have been Paganini, but I forgot what it was, for a Russian orchestra. And the orchestra conductor actually cried. I mean, he wasn't crying like this, but twice he wiped away tears like this. It's just incredible. So you might want to pay attention to her.
I would love.
She won a lot of prizes, and it's just excellent. She's right now studying at Curtis Institute in Philadelphia.
Is she someone you've emailed me about before?
Yes, I have. I think I have emailed you about it.
Okay, I'll go back to the earlier email and follow up, because this spring I'm doing concerto after concerto, so I would love to add her to the list and listen to it.
Yeah, like the fact that she insisted, and the orchestra, then there was sort of disagreement. They finally realized she was right. I mean, a 13-year-old saying that you guys are wrong, play it this way, it's like, that's right. And that's a very interesting dynamic that seems like you deal with the cosmos, because things are out of control.
Yeah.
You have to behave in a way, take into account this other thing that's much broader and in the creative process.
Yeah.
All right. That's all I wanted to say. Just introduce you to the name, so
I
you can
appreciate.
follow her. She's a prodigy. I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure.
I'll
Okay.
go check her out. Thank you, Phil.
That's it.
So I know that Passion would like us, a couple of us at least, to stick around after. But other than that, this wraps up our session for this week. I hope you've all had a
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, I have a meeting with somebody else, so I have to leave.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.